Mr. Mouse, we're ready to go.
Thank you, sir. Good morning, Tom. Good morning, Commissioner Willie. And over to you, Madam Chair.
Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the month of September. I hope everyone is doing well. So today we're going to have a short work session, and then we will shift over to a roundtable. So the first item on the agenda is board and leadership communication. Is there anyone on the board who would like to contribute some updates? Oh, by the way, Commissioner Fye is on vacation, so she won't be joining us.
The only thing I'm sorry. Okay.
Go ahead. No, you go ahead, Roy.
Oh, thank you, Pam. And the chair probably will add some to this, but yesterday we had a couple of hour meeting with our CEO of Clean Water Services, and you all probably will get some briefing. This is all in leading up to her evaluation, but I'm going to give you a little advanced warning that she has put together a very, very powerful 21-page vision for the future, talking about where she sees the organization going in the next 5 to 10 years. I think it's pretty stunning personally. And so it's the kind of thing I like to see from CEOs, and that they're really forecasting what they see happening. So I just alert you, you're all going to get some briefing on that, and it's pretty interesting. So again, the chair may add some more, but that's it.
Thank you, Commissioner Rogers. Go ahead, Commissioner Treese.
Well, first of all, in response to Commissioner Rogers, somehow that am I is it better now?
You're okay.
Okay.
Somebody has a couple of audio streams going at the same time.
It's not me. And I think that my echoing has stopped. Okay. I just wanted to quickly report on two things. We had our community meeting on Monday night. The chair was there and I was there. We got a lot of comment about the arborist report, and this was focused on Kenny Terrace, by the way. It went for the full hour and a half. Staff did a good job of presenting the arborist report, and we got a lot of feedback from the community, which we expected. In fact, there were 45 questions that were posed either in the chat or, well, they were all posed in the chat, but some were live as well, but responded to live. But anyway, it was a productive meeting, and I appreciate the work that the staff went to, and I know there were long hours getting that ready. So thank you very much for that. Yesterday, I had a meeting with Jerry Willie and Matt Craigie and Tom Vanderzand, and really looking at the future of industrial land throughout Washington County, just a discussion that was requested. But Jerry and I had a good discussion afterwards along with Matt. So I'll leave it at that. Jerry, if you'd like to say anything, Commissioner Willie, if you'd like to say anything more.
No, I think that it was a good meeting. It was a good starting conversation. We'll certainly follow up with that, and at some point in time, probably bring a little bit more information back to the commission in a work session, just as an update, or maybe as a roundtable item, just because it's just a conversation right now. So, so yeah, Pam, was that? Are you through with your report? I didn't want to jump in there. Okay. Yeah, for me, it was a week of flavored tobacco conversations. Ordinance 878 had lots of conversations about that, and documents. You're all seeing that. So that's always interesting. I'm thinking about actually going into a convenience store and seeing what this product is. I don't even know the breadth of all of these products that we're talking about, with the exception of the menthol cigarettes, but so I need to do a little bit more research on my part. I'm going to do that this weekend, just so I can know specifically what it is we're dealing with here and the breadth of the products. So anyway, that's on that. Also met with the Western Washington County Emergency Task Force group, Brian Schimmel, and yeah, and the mayor and the Forest Grove councilor, and it was a good group. We were having conversations about, of course, the homeless camp on Highway 47, and a variety of issues, and certainly about the cleanup that we did. And so that was also a very good conversation. There's more work to be done there, and also got a cat update for where they're going with that. So it was an educational week. So had lots of conversations. So I'll leave it at that.
I want to thank you all for mentioning those things, because I came into this meeting not quite organized with my list, and this is reminding me that it's really been a very busy week. So I joined Commissioner Rogers yesterday in a meeting with Diane, our CEO of Clean Water Services, Diane Taniguchi-Dennis, on her contract. You may know that we have a split process, or two different processes, one for her contract updates due in the summer by the July timeframe, and then her annual review. Well, to set the stage, given how we've all had a chance to learn about Clean Water Services, Clean Water Institute, and Clean Water Insurance Corporation, Commissioner Rogers and I talked about how to approach this, and we asked Diane to give us some insight into what are her aspirations as the CEO of these three different endeavors. What does she want to do, and where does she want to go, and where does she see these three efforts going? So it's a really great blueprint, and with regard to next steps, we also looked into different models for her contract. And so you'll be asked to meet with her over this information and the setup. Thank you, Commissioner Treese, for inviting me to join you in the community meeting on the Kenny Terrace project. Yes, you and staff did a really good job of setting up the information with the arborist information, and from that, what might be some additional alternatives. It was really, I learned a lot about practicing the art of the possibilities, and it was a good forum for the neighborhood folks to contribute their questions and share their concerns. Like Commissioner Willie, I've spent a little bit of time on our ordinance with regard to tobacco access for youth, or how to ensure they don't have any further access. I met with the CEO of Plaid Pantry. I've not yet had the opportunity to sync up with the Jewel contact, so we'll see how that goes. You may all have noticed through either the Supportive Housing Services monthly newsletter or the information I posted on my chair Facebook page that our Supportive Housing Services program reached a significant milestone in achieving and exceeding having 100 year-round shelter beds available within the next year. So our team has worked really hard on that, and I'm really proud of the work that they've done. They're continuing to do work not only with engaging with our community members on multiple projects, but also working with Metro and our partner counties on the intergovernmental agreement, the long-term intergovernmental agreement for that program, and that will be coming to us in future weeks as well. And then lastly, as if that wasn't enough for 1 week, I had the pleasure of joining in a very small, carefully orchestrated, groundbreaking event for our first affordable housing bond program project from that big NOFA program, that big first portfolio of, I believe, over 800, almost 800 units. The Valfrey at Avenida 26 out in Forest Grove. So it was really interesting. I've been going by this location for years, either on my bicycle or in a car or just walking on foot. But it's a former cement plant with a parking lot abutting Main Street. And now there are going to be five smallish buildings that will make up this new home community for some folks who need safe and stable housing. So a lot to be proud of, and it was really nice to honor Val Valfrey and recognize him. So that's pretty much it in a nutshell. Here we are at the doorstep of the month of September, the very beginning days of a new month, preparing to enjoy a 3-day holiday with Labor Day and the kids returning to school next week. So we're transitioning now. I love it. I'm looking forward to us being on the downside of this Delta variant and really getting back into a more normal scheme of things, virus willing. But I know we are a flexible and nimble agency. Thank you, Cia Lindstrom, for reminding me of that theme. And I know we'll have brighter days ahead of us. So I think that's it for board communications. Any last thoughts from commissioners? Go ahead, Commissioner Treese.
I just wanted to add in that I also participated in the flavored tobacco communication with Commissioner Willie, and have a meeting set up with Marnie to make sure that I understand all the aspects of this. It's complicated, and I'm really glad that all of us are working forward to make sure we understand this issue.
And I'm starting to wonder if we need to reconvene in a work session on what we're doing. I don't know, given that there's been a first reading, if we can do that. So I'll take that offline with Mr. Carr and see how we can go from there. But I think there are several of us that are learning more, both about the way the ordinance is written and also the marketplace and what we're trying to achieve. So I'll take that as an AR. So. Okay, why don't we turn it over to leadership communications? Miss Angie.
Good morning, Chair Harrington, Board of Commissioners. I feel like this last week has just succumbed to COVID operation conversations. And our staff are doing an amazing job ensuring safety within the workplace, adjusting their operations. For example, West Slope Library has adjusted their operations. It is a smaller footprint of a library to ensure that not only staff are safe, but visitors who use the library are safe as well. So that has been a focus throughout all departments this week. We do have 9 employee COVID cases and 15 employees who are quarantining right still due to close contact. So that number is consistent with the number that I reported last week. From a weather standpoint, there is nothing to report still. However, the team is closely monitoring this because this is the time of year that we start to see dry east winds that could impact our fire conditions. So I will only provide updates if we start to see a change in these conditions. There were a few of you that had brought up housing, SHS. Happy to report, had a meeting this week with our housing team as well as our HR team. We are going to be moving forward with a structural assessment within our housing department. As the board is aware, housing has seen rapid growth within the last couple of years, and we need to really ensure that we have the right structure in place to support the work ongoing and into the future. And so really happy to kick this work off. We are expecting that we should have the results from that process in somewhere between 6 to 9 months, and we can report back to the board at that time. And that concludes my update.
Mr. Carr, how about you?
Good morning, Madam Chair. My focus has also mostly been on COVID this week. I don't have anything to add to Ms. Angie other than just help support the wonderful job she's doing. Thank you.
Thank you. Diane Taniguchi-Dennis, Clean Water Services, CWI, quick.
Thank you, Chair Harrington, and good morning, Board of Clean Water Services. We too are in COVID operations. We have 15 exposure cases that we're managing. 7 of them are direct positive cases in their homes, so their households. 2 are related to children. So far, though, we only have 1 employee that's tested positive, but HR is really busy making sure that we're supporting the team as well as our internal incident command. We're making sure we have continuity of operations at the treatment facilities and also with our field ops and the rest of the team. So they're all doing a great job and working through this. The CWAC and our normal board CWAC barbecue and canoe trip on the river to see the river has been canceled. I know it's disappointing. We wanted to see Commissioner Treese on her paddleboard again. That would have been so great, right? But we did cancel that. Mark also wanted me to highlight you on an email that he sent to you. They're a little worried that some of our privy councils, whether or not they're getting to you. So we're going to check with each of you to make sure you're actually getting them on some of the highlights for what's going on at Clean Water Services. But just a lot going on. So I really appreciate Chair Harrington and meeting with Director Rogers on my reflection. It started off with them asking me, so what are your aspirations? What do you want to do? Where do you want to go? Those very simple questions turned into a 21-page blueprint, but I'm really excited to share with all of you. And Chair Harrington reminded me, you can't do all of this in year 1, Diane. It's just not possible. So I said, no, it's a 10-year sort of look of where we need to go. And many of these strategies are based on timing and opportunity. So I really appreciate that. And I'll share that with the rest of the board by adding some additional context. And I look forward to working with all of you. So thank you.
All righty. Well, with that, why don't we dive in then to our topic of today's work session, the Enhanced Sheriff Patrol District, ESPD levy planning discussion. There's Aaron Calvert.
Good morning. I believe Sheriff Garrett is on here too. Sorry, as I adjust my settings. Good morning, Chair Harrington and Board of Commissioners. I'm Aaron Calvert with the County Administrative Office. I'm joined today also by Sheriff Garrett, and thank you for making time for this work session after we ran out of time on August 24th to present and discuss the levy planning on the Enhanced Sheriff Patrol District. Next slide, please. The focus of today's presentation is to provide an ESPD service overview and then a timeline overview regarding election and ballot referral options with an overlay of community engagement opportunities that the board was interested in during our last levy presentation in May of this year. So starting in 2022, there are 3 set elections before the levy expires on June 30th of 2023. We'll spend some time talking about the May or the November 2022 options, but it is worth noting there's also an election set, of course, for May of 2023. As your board knows, in May of 2023, the board and staff would be working through the fiscal year 23-24 budget planning process. So planning for a levy at that point would add a layer of complexity and may be considered a last option, but it is an option nonetheless. For the various community engagement efforts, we'll spend some time discussing those opportunities as part of the Levy outreach plan. And as always, I like to lead with the question that we will also ask at the end so that your board is aware of the direction that we are seeking today. And that is, would the board prefer to target a ballot referral for the May 2022 or the November 2022 election? I'm now going to turn the next few slides over to Sheriff Garrett for the ESPD service overview.
Thank you, Erin. Good morning, Chair Harrington and commissioners. Thank you so much for allowing myself to provide a levy overview. I'm joined today by our Business Services Manager, John Steyer. The Enhanced Sheriff's Patrol District, as you will recall, encompasses the more densely populated, unincorporated areas that lie outside cities, but require a higher level of police services than rural areas. Before ESPD was established in 1987, service levels in what is now the district was well below the urban service level at just over 1/2 a deputy per 1,000 residents. And during ESPD's formation, a Washington County Public Safety Review Committee was established and responsible for service recommendations to the board. The committee met 13 times in 1985, and as a minimum service level, the committee recommended 1 deputy per 1,000 residents. Commissioners established the district in 1987, and voters approved funding to increase service levels to about 1 deputy per 1,000 residents. Slide, please. There's a map actually in your packet from the previous work session, which I actually like better than this one. It's a really good detailed map that you may have available. But this map, county overview, literally probably about 30,000 foot view. The area in brown represents the current district boundaries labeled ESPD. And really, it just serves to illustrate that every commissioner district has a portion of the ESPD, most prominently in districts 2 and 1, less so in district 3, and a slice in district 4. The population in the district currently is estimated to be around 237,000 residents. Slide, please. This slide depicts how the district residents get a service level of about 1 deputy per 1,000 residents. And I'll begin at the bottom of the graph with the base or foundational general fund service level provided to every unincorporated resident of about 1/3 of a deputy per 1,000 residents, no matter whether you live in Aloha, Bethany, or Buxton. The middle of the graph depicts the service level of 0.18 deputy per 1,000 residents, supported by the county-wide public safety local option levy, which was created to fund restoration of several criminal justice system services that had eroded significantly prior to the levy's original passage in 2000. The top of the graph represents the service level of 0.54 deputy per 1,000 residents, funded through a permanent district tax rate of 64 cents per $1,000 assessed value of property and a levy rate of 68 cents per $1,000 assessed value. Thinking back to 1997, the passage of Measure 50, that converted Oregon's property tax rate from a levy system to largely a tax rate system, and the impact on the ESPD levy at that time, it reduced the levy by 15% and converted it to a permanent tax rate. That's how we get that permanent tax rate of 64 cents. While 1 deputy per 1,000 is a service level lower than you will find in other urban public safety service providers, history has shown, I believe, to be effective. When you consider relative crime rates, 911 response, case investigation and clearance rates, economies of scale from a single district, and voter support over 30 years. Slide, please. This slide is very self-explanatory, but I'll just highlight a few points when we're able to advance the slide. Thank you. The existence of the district is literally how community members who are victims of major crimes and lesser crimes get a response to an investigation into those crimes. It's literally how we get 911 response that is immediate. You know, at times we might divert a deputy from a lower priority call, but we can in virtually every case, when someone calls 911, we get deputies rolling right away. We prioritize crisis intervention and de-escalation. Super important, more important today really than any time in my career. And then trust building, right? This service level allows us, or the levy services allow us to invest the time it takes to build trust, to have conversations with community members, to show up out of uniform when we need to do that, to meet community members where they're at, where they're comfortable, and current service levels provide us the opportunity to do that. Slide, please. This is just a snapshot of current staff. It's probably familiar to you. The top uniform staff is really the staff that you think of certified deputies and leadership that provide those public safety services in a district. It also, the photo illustrates a good example of our high esteem for partnerships and safe outcomes. In this case, our mental health response team, one of those teams is pictured here, where we partner with county mental health, addictions professionals, local hospitals, people with lived experience in a robust crisis system. The non-uniform staff below, also really important to support effective Levy services, district services, including services like phone and in-person contact at our records counter 24 hours a day. They report, they process reports, make distribution. They do law enforcement data systems entry for things like runaways, restraining orders, warrants, and the like. Our general services aide performs quartermaster duties to help account for and manage our equipment like cars, radios, protective vests, and the like. Information systems analyst 2 helps us manage and keep our information technology systems functioning, like the mobile display terminals and the patrol cars that deputies use to receive calls and write reports and communicate oftentimes with the public through email. And then our senior program educators, they help us get to community groups. They help when and where we need to, so that we can reflect that community lens in our services, answer questions, ensure that we are available when and where we need to be to build trust with the community. Our senior program educator is bilingual, bicultural, with a focus on our Latino community. Slide, please. This next slide on the left is the estimated cost for the current 5-year levy period. And on the right is a comparative hypothetical, right? Hypothetical cost for what would be a projected next 5-year levy period. It's an initial look. We still have some pencil sharpening to do, and it's by no means final. But it does, the key takeaway here for us is that the levy rate will increase possibly by as much as 15 cents. The biggest drivers are personnel and indirect costs. And of our indirect costs, liability insurance and information technology appears to be our largest cost drivers. We are working closely with Washington County Finance. Judy Lynn's doing a great job at helping us refine these numbers, but wanted to just ensure that you had a look at how they are shaping up. Slide, please. We take seriously our commitment to reflect the district's needs, and examples in our recent history include partnering with Washington County Health and the school districts to alert the community about the deadly threat from fentanyl, updating our policy to require de-escalation whenever feasible, and also to ban neck restraints. We implemented a body-worn camera program thanks to your support to showcase deputies' good work, improve training, and a check on our accountability. And in building that program, we worked with our Latino Advisory Commission to ensure that our policy reflected the community concerns and priorities to ensure that it aligned with community needs as well. Using our training center to practice de-escalation in challenging training scenarios to better prepare our staff for real-world challenging scenarios to resolve them as safely as possible, and to provide training updates about taking action when probable cause exists for a vice crime, and in those scenarios where it doesn't meet the statutory requirements for a crime, but it's still an incident that needs to be reported and tracked. We continue to learn from our community, staff, and national experts, and we're privileged and honored to serve the district. Slide, please. Erin?
Thank you, Sheriff Garrett. The next few slides will relate to the timeline of the first 2 election options, May or November of 2022, and will highlight the efforts of community engagement in partnership with the Sheriff's Office and the County Administrative Office in the context of the election and the filing deadlines. So this slide starts with the premise of the May 2022 election. The dates listed are the best estimates based on the information we have today, and of course they may shift slightly. But moving from left to right on your screen, the first box titled August, the community survey is an outreach effort that the Sheriff's Office is coordinating for residents and business owners of the Enhanced Sheriff's Patrol District. Through an RFP process, a vendor has been selected, and the Sheriff's Office, in partnership with the Office of Equity, Inclusion, and Community Engagement, are working on the survey questions, which I believe are nearing final stages. In the lower left-hand corner, I had just noticed this work session as part of the timeline, which of course has changed now to September 2nd. Moving to the right, under August to September, the Levy planning team has partnered with community engagement staff, and if the board selects the May election option, the team will work to provide community listening sessions in September. There have been some preliminary discussions on that plan, and then depending on board direction, that process will be fleshed out in more detail really soon. In and during the month of September, the community survey is scheduled to be in the field. As you can see through the September-October timeline, the community survey will be completed, and the vendor will compile and analyze the data to produce a report around mid-October, excuse me. Also during this time, community engagement would be finalizing their report from the listening sessions and then outline the themes and priorities. Next slide, please. In late October, we would have information to share with the board on the community survey, the listening sessions, and then begin to shape that feedback into a more detailed proposal development, which would include, as the sheriff mentioned, a financial overview and scenario options for the board's consideration. This work would help inform the voter survey, which would then be targeted to finalize the first 2 weeks of November and be in the field the middle part of November to early December. In mid-December, we would return to the board for consideration of the levy proposal and survey findings. Then in early January of 2022, we would come back to work session and continue to work with your board for feedback and approval of the levy proposal and direction to draft ballot material. I've listed some of the deadline dates for frame of reference on adopting ballot material and explanatory statements in February and March, noting that the last board meetings to ensure the topic is on the docket for presentation, approval, and adoption before the statutory deadline, which would be March 17th. Next slide, please. So now we'll move to the timeline for a November 2022 election. While this slide does start out in January of 2022, it should be noted that because the Sheriff's Office community survey is happening right now, that would continue as noted on slide 10. And the report and feedback would be completed this fall, and that would help tee up the conversations for community listening sessions as noted on this slide. In this scenario, the Community Engagement Office would do the planning and preparation for community listening sessions in January and February, with the goal of holding the listening sessions in March. Their report would be finalized in April, again noting themes and priorities from the community, and we would plan to return to work session in mid-April to provide the update on the community feedback and discuss the voter survey and proposal development. The voter survey would be finalized around mid-May and go out in the field late May through mid-June. We would launch that after the May election, just so we wouldn't confuse voters. In June, we would return to your board to present the levy proposal and survey findings, receive feedback and direction, and ultimately work toward approval from your board to draft material or ballot material toward the end of June. Next slide, please. In mid-July, we would present the draft material and explanatory statement and ask your board to adopt the material so County Council could file. The August 16th date is mentioned as the last possible board meeting date to adopt ballot material to ensure filing deadlines for a November election. Next slide, please. This community outreach slide references the work that begins after the board directs staff to file the measure and also notes the timeline where political restrictions on public employees begin. This captures some of the community outreach work that is done between the state and the election, but the outreach efforts will become more robust as we move through this process. And as the sheriff mentioned, it would also be inclusive of the Latino Advisory Commission, as well as the ESPD Advisory Council and other community groups. Next slide, please. That concludes the presentation. What questions does the board have? And then does the board have enough information to wish to target the ballot referral for May or November of 2022?
Commissioners, do you have any questions or information needs or comments that you'd like to share at this time? Go ahead, Commissioner Treese, and then Commissioner Rogers.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the presentation, Sheriff Garrett and Aaron. I appreciate it. I guess I'm looking for information about viability of either date in terms of passage of this ballot net referral. So I'm concerned about that. And I am the other piece that I want to make sure that I'm asking, and I will be asking all the way through, is as the district commissioner with a large portion of this service area, I want to make sure how I am engaging and making sure that I can help it at any point. So my preference would be to go to May and to make sure that we have the opportunity to have November as a backup if we need to. But I'm asking for input on that recommendation or thought at this time.
Sheriff Garrett, do you want to take that first?
Yes, Chair Harrington, Commissioner Treese, Commissioners, thank you for your question, Commissioner Treese. We at the Sheriff's Office we're pretty nimble with respect to working a renewal or replacement. This would be a replacement, right? And I think we can absolutely make May work. Of course, we defer to your good judgment and your final decision, but we're optimistic May would work well. Give voters, the chance to just focus best on this. Of course, we don't know what would come in November, but I think May can work absolutely for us. Thank you.
And Commissioner Treese, I would just add for your second question on being included in the community engagement piece, that is something we'll work with community engagement on specifically to work with you in your district and the other commissioners and Chair Harrington, of course, with their respective districts as well, ensuring that we have a full plan for community engagement.
Thank you, Commissioner Rogers.
Just a couple of 3 points. One, I agree to your timing. My preference would be May of 22, just in case anything were to go wrong, we would have backup in November. Secondly, I asked a question, this is more for more information, the sheriff, about contracting. If you take a look at the map, you're going to see a lot of slivers of property. You've got some large areas in the North County, but down in the southern end of the county, the intent was almost 40 years ago that a lot of that probably would be annexed by now. And I still think there is an opportunity to contract on those slivers, whether they be in Tiger or Tualatin, with those abutting jurisdictions, so that we're not running people from Hillsborough to South Tualatin, for instance. So I'm hoping to do that, to have that conversation. The last thing is it's been a critical piece in all of our service level to major areas of unincorporated, and I think it would be a major mistake not to continue on with the levy. So that's my comments.
Mr. Carr and Ms. Angie, would you like to add anything on the viability of contracting?
I'm happy to do that, Chair. It is viable. There's nothing in the levy that would restrict the ability of the county to contract with an outside service provider or a city or someone else to provide those services. The levy does not require that they be provided by the sheriff.
Do you feel, Commissioner Rogers, that your questions satisfactorily answered, or
No, I think
follow up appropriately?
No, thank you very much. No, I think they have been. I just think we need to take a serious look. It's these are not inexpensive services for a large part of the unincorporated area to the north of my particular district, District 1 predominantly. This is a lifeline to those kinds of services. So I understand and it's economically feasible. but take a look at the map. I encourage everyone, and you're going to see little slivers of properties, some Sherwood, some Tualatin, some Tiger, that I think we just should have the conversation. I think it's about time. So thank you.
Commissioner Willie, did you want to share anything? No? Okay. So I'll go next. I have always valued the Enhanced Sheriff Patrol District in addition to the wider work of our Sheriff's Department. Whether it was being a resident of Bethany for 15 years or now having certainly constituents all across the county, but also friends who live in these urban unincorporated areas. I'm very supportive of moving forward in a May timeframe as well. I looked back at the life of the levy and what the election cycles that it was posed, and I think May is just a good time for that. I do have a few more comments and questions I'd like to pursue. So as I think about, putting myself in Jane and Joe Q. Public's chair, on slide 8, for looking at this next 5-year time period, I appreciate how you have forecasted out, tried to project what the future may look like. Great crystal ball time. Thank you. And I can certainly relate to the needs for personnel as well as cost coverage. We demand so much of these employees to be prepared for their job, trained well for their job, and just costs involved. So I heard your message of that, the next rate could involve a 15-cent increase. No problem with that. What jumped out at me is the indirect cost increase. And it's not that that by itself concerns me. It's not about the number per se, but I need some reminders of what goes into indirect costs, right? That's really what I need. So I don't need it today. If you want to list it off today, great, but just the reminder of that would really be helpful. Then do you want me to pause there to see if you wanted to answer that now? I don't mean to be rapid fire.
Sheriff Garrett, you had mentioned some of the indirect costs in your slide. Did you want to take that one?
I'm happy to talk to that if you like.
Go ahead, John. Thank you.
Yeah, so indirect cost is one of those things that we do have to manage, particularly as we look at that next levy period. But as I look at the cost through our cost plan, and about 15% of that goes to overhead, HR, county leadership, those kind of things. About 25% is IT. About 17% is liability insurance, and that has been increasing. And then about 40% is for the sheriff office to help with training and things like that. So it's all detailed in the cost plan. And it's just a matter of how we look at that over the next 5 years, and can we cut costs there?
Okay. Well, I guess I need to get a little bit more familiar with that cost plan, that's all. So, and it really goes towards making sure that I understand that. So if I find myself in a position of entertaining a question about that, I'm proficient. So thank you very much. To Commissioner Treese's question about viability of either date, will future steps of surveying or polling provide any insight into that question?
Chair Harrington, are you asking whether what is on each election, like what we know about what's coming on each election? So I know right now, we did a look back what happened 5 years ago, and I know the Hillsborough Police Fire Parks levy expires in 2023. The Forest Grove Police Fire Parks Library expires in 2023. The Beaverton School District local option levy expires in 2024. And of course, that's the one that could potentially have overlap with voters in the district. So we know that right now. Of course, we don't know whether that's going to be May or November, but or even the following year, but that's just a look back of the local option levies from 5 years ago.
Well, I also seem to recall, I was thinking back to our public safety levy polling that we did in the fall, and it wasn't so much about the timing, but just people's thoughts about the service suite. And the timeline, I wasn't sure where that step might be.
So we'll be working with a polling firm. If we go with a May election, we would be working with a polling firm late this fall,
Okay.
that November, and that would be informed by what we learned from our community listening sessions, as well as the Sheriff's Office community survey. That will help us kind of tee up those questions, look at voter attitude, perspective, and get that information. That would be part of what would come back to your board in, let's see, the December timeline, mid-December.
Ooh, December is going to be hopping busy. It's essentially a 2-week month.
I know.
Oh, hang on to your seats, folks. It's a busy year. Okay, great. Then my last, well, actually, two things. So I appreciated the 5-year projecting. My gut or base methodology on levies is, especially when you do a replacement, I like to think that we can set it at a levy that will last for two cycles. So in this case, a 10-year cycle. I just want to ask, as you have projected out for FY 24 through 28, I need to rely upon you, Ms. Angie, Ms. Calvert, Sheriff Garrett, and Mr. Steyer to just give me the head nod that you see that level at this time to be workable for a 10-year time period. That's all. Or before we set the rate, that you have a comfort level. Now, of course, stuff happens. So, I'm asking you in a 2022 or 2021, 2022 timeframe, and I'm not going to hold you accountable to it through those 10 years. Don't worry. Who knows what'll happen in the next 10 years. So, okay. And another reason why I'm interested in May, there's an opportunity cost with all of these things. The cost of elections, what it takes to focus on something. And I just think we're going to be better positioned to move forward with this in May than in November. The one last ingredient that at this stage of the game, looking ahead, I think would be helpful. With all that we have traveled in these last 2.5 years, I think one thing that will help us in our community engagement is if we as a Washington County agency can have a clear set of information about what our agency is doing to improve mental health, behavioral health, and homeless services. Because our sheriff's department, just like every police department, has been the response of last resort, right? and has had to deal with society ills that have not been addressed in other places. And I think we, as a county agency, owe it to our community to know more about, or crisply, what we've been doing and what we're continuing to do, which means we're better at servicing community needs because counties do this, providing these services as part of our portfolio, but it has the added benefit of reducing those societal pressures on our sheriff's patrol. So I don't have the crisp answer for that yet, but I just think it might help us along the way.
Absolutely. Thank you for that.
So that's all I had. So I heard a clear thumbs up from 3 of us that were full steam ahead on May. Don't know Commissioner Willie's thumbs up as well. So I think I didn't print your last slide for myself, but I think if I remember your questions and your setup next steps, that we've achieved your goal for today.
Absolutely. Thank you for the direction. And the next steps were about just us returning with all the other information you just talked about, the finances, the community engagement plan, the details of moving forward. So we'll be back to you for that. So thank you for your time today.
Well, thank you for your robust and comprehensive work. Really appreciate it. We do great work together.
Thanks.
All righty. Is there anything else for the order with regard to our work session for today? Okay, seeing none, would folks like to take just a quick 10-minute break before we reconvene to roundtable? Great. And Kevin, we stay with the same Zoom link, don't we?
We do, Madam Chair.
Okay, great. Well, why don't we reconvene then at 9:35 for a roundtable? Okay, see you in 10 minutes then. Thank you. Okay, commissioners, how are we doing? All righty. So welcome back, everyone. We're now in our Thursday, September 2nd roundtable of the Washington County Board of Commissioners. We received an updated packet yesterday. So just for a quick kickoff and a convening, we have 4 of the 5 members of the Washington County Board of Commissioners. Commissioner Fye is on vacation today. So we're going to just touch on the roundtable plan out future months. We have a few things stacking up, and also touch on the CAO annual review. And then the big ticket, big topic of the day is going over some budget information, specifically what other budgeting processes look like, what it means to have community engagement in budgeting, equity in budgeting, the budget process. And as always, Jack's always really good about giving us good forecast information and where things stand. So that's what we'll be going over. So today it looks like we'll only need to have a morning roundtable meeting. So hopefully we'll be able to get through it all. So we'll have some bonus time back on our calendars this afternoon. Is everybody all set with that, or any thoughts you wanted to raise? Nope. Okay. All righty. Well, as usual, our board clerk and staff have tried to arrange things out into the forward months. So we have the rolling agenda. And as always, if you have any questions about that, please be sure to work with Ms. Angie. I'd like to bring your attention to the current roundtable plans document. You can see, in forward months, we have a meeting in October, November, December, and then we're into a new year, 2022. Let's see if maybe we can put all this involved global pandemic work somewhat behind us with that new year. What do you say? So you can see over in the left-hand column that we have a few different topics that we've put in this list as a result of our July 22nd roundtable. We had our first conversation about climate challenges with great information from our team. We'll need to come back to that in the future. Discussion about service levels and urban services, just a discussion of the board about that. Potential conversation about term limits. Commissioner Rogers has mentioned that. And then community engagement compensation, what it means to ask community partners to be more involved with us versus asking them to just do that out of the goodness of their heart. And today, Commissioner Willie mentioned something as well for a potential conversation. And I have to say, unfortunately, I have forgotten the topic already. I might have noted it down. I didn't. Oh, future of industrial lands. That's what it was. Okay.
Even though I mentioned, even though I mentioned that I'd already forgotten what I was, what you were referring to. So I'm glad you had. Pam would have brought us back on track, though, I'm sure.
Well, in case I needed reminding that I'm in good company here as a member of the board. So we'll have to sort out how we sequence these different things. So that's all fine and dandy. And then looking out, we've got, we want to make sure we know what's happening process-wise with our Clean Water Services annual review, our 6-month review for our county council, then try to get some building blocks set up for how we orient ourselves for the future year, just crafting up some draft board initiatives and goals. Having a conversation in October about the forming community strategic plan and talking about some process outcomes that we'd like for that, and then moving forward so that by the time we hit the month of January, we feel like, okay, we've laid a good foundation for ourselves and we can get rocking and rolling. If you have any other ideas for conversations that would be good for us to kick around and discuss as a board, please bring those forward. I'm all ears on that. Was there anything else that people wanted to raise or? Great. All righty. So on the CAO annual review kickoff, so what we did, one of the things we did at our July 22nd roundtable is we looked at the need for our 3 executive level reports that we have to the board, our CAO, our county council, and CWS CEO. So Commissioner Treese volunteered to work with me on the CAO annual review to put that together, bring a recommended draft to the board for us to close on that and go over it with the CAO. Similarly, Commissioner Willie helping with the County Council 6-month review. And as you heard earlier, Commissioner Rogers and I teaming up on the CWS, CWI quick CEO review. So I've worked with Brenda to leverage our experience to date on both the process with the CWS CEO annual review, as well as the somewhat short form process for the 6-month reviews. And Brenda is helping me finalize that. So I'll share that out to the board so that you've got a view of that. But I feel much better prepared, a little less overwhelmed than I would have a couple of months ago in getting this planned out and getting it done. It doesn't feel like a heavy lift anymore. It feels like just here's the work that needs to be done and let's go do it. So a few more hands to do the work. And as always, HR from each agency is really helpful in putting together base infrastructure surveys and all of that. So really, that's all I wanted to make sure I raised on that topic. Any thoughts or concerns that maybe I haven't addressed? No? Okay, great. So stay tuned. I'll get you an email on that. Okay, so is everybody ready to do a deep dive into the budget end of the pool? Woohoo, here we go. It's Budget Olympics. So we'll turn it over to a great trio of Tanya Angie, our county administrator, Jack Leong, our chief financial officer, and Latricia Tillman, our chief equity and inclusion officer. Take it away, expert team.
Thank you. And I see the other members of the team joining, so I'm happy for that because I can't do this alone, that's for sure. One item, Chair, that you had mentioned on the roundtable that we are going to be hopefully taking off the list today is the budget process education. Next slide, please. So it's always nice to put a check mark next to the work sometimes and say, we're done. So hopefully today's conversation will be a first conversation to meet the board's needs. Jack, we're going to start the conversation today with the general fund forecast. Jack will provide that overview because there is new information since the last time we were in front of the board with the general fund forecast.
Only good news. Today's only a good news day.
We will be sharing the general fund forecast.
I tried.
And Jack will share what is new in the forecast, and then also what may be changing, because this is just a point in time. Then Jack has done some great work providing an educational overview of different budgeting processes that local governments use. Latricia will be providing some framing as far as how we will start to center equity in our budget process. Then we'll discuss community engagement. And the last portion will be an overview of the budget process, which will include the internal process, but then also the board's involvement, budget committee involvement, and then most importantly too, what are the opportunities for community to be involved in our budget process? So a really robust conversation today. Next slide. And this is where I'll turn it to Jack.
Thank you. Thank you, Tanya. Good morning, Chair. Good morning, Commissioners. Thank you very much for your time looking at budgeting topics today. So as Tanya mentioned, we will start off with a general fund forecast update. And I do want to say that the good news over here is that we do a very thorough update on a regular basis with our general fund forecast. No matter what the future holds, at least we're planning ahead and trying to do very good planning for the county. Now, looking at this 3 columns of numbers that you're seeing, what we're looking at over here is the key assumption changes. So back in fiscal year 21-22 adopted budget, that's the first column of numbers that you're seeing. Second column is the financial update number 1 that we did a few months back. And what we're looking at right now, the latest information is in the third column, fiscal year 2021-22, financial number 2. And usually I use the color green to highlight positive changes in the key assumptions, and the color orange to highlight some concerning changes that is worth noting. So you can see that there are actually 2 major changes in the key assumptions in this iteration of the update. The first one is the cost of living adjustment. As you may remember that we follow the CPIW Western region to calculate our COLA on an annual basis. And the trend right now is trending upward to 5.5% toward the end of the year, which is higher than the previously projected 2.5% average that we were anticipating. Obviously, inflation is not news to anybody. You can't turn on any news page without seeing at least some articles about the high inflation concerns in the economy, and that is definitely affecting us as an organization on the COLA rate perspective. So we currently it's standing at about 4%. If the trend continues, by the end of the year, we'll hit 5.5% or even above. And the second thing I want to bring up is that our excellent HR team has come to a near completion of the pay equity study, and then the preliminary financial impact that we estimated is a one-time impact of $1.5 million, and then an ongoing impact of close to $1 million each year, about 900,000. And that is, of course, it's still an estimate just because we still haven't yet decided a cutoff date to implement. And every day that we count, there are folks being promoted, there are new folks being hired, and then we do have to account for all of those small changes in that. But this number should be pretty close to reality when it actually gets implemented. So those are the 2 things.
Jack, can I just interrupt here? For the board's awareness, we are planning to schedule time with the board around the pay equity study update in October. So you'll learn more at that time.
Thank you, Tanya. So those are really the two major key assumption changes, which is really affecting our general fund forecast picture by quite a bit, I would say. So let's move on to the next slide and take a look at how that affected our general fund forecast picture. Next slide, please. So this is where our trend is with the current assumption. As you can see that we are looking at a downward trend in the next 5 years with this current assumption. And that is only assuming 5.5% COLA for this 1 year. If the inflation rate continues on for future years, the downward trend can even be a little more severe than what you're looking at right now. As you can see, we will still be able to maintain 16.1%. We're anticipating to maintain 16.1%, but really we'll get into struggle mode to be in compliance with the board fund balance reserve policy starting in fiscal year 22-23, and then continue that trend downward for the rest of the 5-year forecast. Next slide, please. So what would be some measures that could be implemented to bend the trend back without any other positive outcomes that may come our way later? One of the scenario, as requested by Commissioner Rogers last time, is that he would like to see some scenarios. One of the scenario is actually a longer budget reduction period, which equates to a longer service impact period. Obviously, we can't reduce the budget without impacting the services that's actually are in operations. And what that means is previously in our last assumption, we assumed year 1 a 2% reduction, year 2 a 1% reduction, and then year 3 and year 4 go back to normal. So this scenario basically prolongs that reduction period for a 4-year period of consecutive 2% reduction. And that will, you can see that we will still struggle in fiscal year 23-24, but then after that, we would have a healthier trend to grow back to the 15% minimum fund balance requirement. And that is the first scenario. I see a hand raised by Commissioner Willie. Go ahead.
Yeah, Jack, for dollar value, what does 1% equate in dollars?
That is an excellent question. Our 1% of fund balance, our fund balance right now is tracing at about $30 to $40 million. So 1% equates to about that 400,000. Put up my general fund forecast to provide you the exact number.
Okay. That's close enough, Jack. I just, again, it's good to see these in percentages, but it's, for me, it's also, I need to kind of equate that to dollars we're talking about. So, okay, thank you.
Yep, absolutely. And we measure that against the net revenue. That's what we measure that against. Next slide, please. So the next scenario is one that we actually wouldn't recommend, but we just wanted to bring it up for information sharing, is capping the non-rep COLA at 2.5%, as that has been implemented very rarely by local jurisdictions, but sometimes it has been. It's not uncommon, and that would actually help us bring the trend backward starting in fiscal year 23-24 as well. You can see that it's less effective with a budget reduction, obviously, and then I have to say it is oftentimes used as a temporary measure, just because we still have our principle to compare our salaries to market and try to stay competitive with market. So capping the COLA will definitely hold us back, which will only give us a reason to grow that back later in future years when the market catches up. So it is a temporary measure that can be implemented, but it doesn't solve the long-term problem if we are in a downward trend. So those are the two scenarios that I have put in. Obviously, we will be working with the CEO on a regular basis to look for different ways to handle the economic factor that's coming to us, the current financial conditions that is within the organization. So that work is still ongoing and not finalized. We're not proposing either of these options to be a final option going into this next budget year. These are just possible scenarios that we have put out there. Next slide, please. Any questions about the general fund forecast update so far? I see Chair Harrington first.
Go ahead, Jerry.
Oh, okay. Jack, did you look at a blend of the longer budget reduction, service impact period 2%, and the capping of the COLA? I mean, is that possible to do a little bit of a mix and match on that to maybe, I guess, flatten that line at 15%? Would that be possible?
We could, as I was explaining, that neither of these are final deciding factor. We could possibly do a blend of both. We could possibly look at other opportunities. It's all under development. And as you can see, neither scenarios actually bring us back to the 15% in the fiscal year 23-24. And that is something that we'll need to look at and continue to monitor and try to think creatively on bringing that back into compliance.
Yeah, and I realize this is kind of a swag.
Yes.
So we'll, as the further along we go and closer we get to budget season, of course, that picture will become more clear. So yeah, I get that. Absolutely.
And the reserve is obviously reserved for economic impacts for an organization. So if we do have a temporary measure and it is building our reserve policy to say that the economic factor is a reason to dip in there temporarily with the expectation of restoration within, I don't recall the period, but within a reasonable amount of period. I know, Chair Harrington, do you have a question?
Yes, just a couple of things. So part of what I think we are learning as an agency, well, as a community really, is that during the course of every year, conditions change. And so I would suggest that, I wish I'd thought of this ahead of time, but I would like to have a slide before your general fund forecast update to be what that curve looked like when we adopted the budget, right?
Yes.
Because it illustrates to our community that conditions have changed, and that we as a board have to work with staff to adjust to these conditions as we go ahead. So that was just one. And then the second one was just, I appreciate you're doing this scenario work. So as you illustrated on slide number 5, and Commissioner Willie asked about what a 1% general fund reduction might look like financially. If I heard you correctly, it was about 300K to 400K, which in my math, then I then take that and carry it forward. Given an employee burden rate, I equate that to anywhere between 2 and 4 FTE positions. Am I correct in carrying that math forward?
Yeah, actually, let me correct myself. My brain math wasn't working with the right denominator. Yeah, I was comparing to the fund balance rather than the net revenue, which is where we measure the percentage at. 1% of net revenue is actually $2.4 million.
Okay.
That was a mistake I made.
Okay, so then, that would be, taking that then would be 240K, which is 1 to 2 FTE, correct?
No, so clarification is that the 2.4 equates to 1%. So 1%, if we want to measure that in FTE, that would be about 20 FTEs, I want to say.
Golly, Catherine.
Yeah.
Thank you. Right.
Yep. And it was my mistake. Yeah, I confused you. Apologies.
No, that's okay. That's a lot of heads. Okay. Whoa. And then, cutting staff means cutting services. Wow. Those are going to be painful conversations we're going to need to have. I don't look forward to those conversations. But I always appreciate that you're bringing us the data that we need, Jack. Eyes wide open, ears wide open. So good job. At the same time, I don't believe in cutting heads without cutting services, because then you're just asking who's left to do more work. At the same time that capping COLA has impacts as well. So I think what I'm coming to is I had spent the first part of this year really adjusting to this current fiscal year, or the proposed budget leading into the adopted budget was the first year of 3 years of cut budgets. And it just got a little more difficult. And so between now and when we adopt the budget, the end of June of 2022, I know I'm going to need some additional time. And I'll have to work with Ms. Angie to figure out how we navigate that as a board and also as a community as well. I think we'll have some additional explaining to do, so to speak. So, okay, that's it for me. But Commissioner Rogers and Commissioner Treese have some additional questions as well. Go ahead, Commissioner Rogers, you were first.
Now, Chair Harrington, I actually do have a comment before we proceed to the next step. I think we have a couple of different percentages that's thrown out there. For the benefit of public, I'd like to add one more clarification. So when I mentioned the 1%, I interpreted the question as 1% of the general fund reserve, and that is the $2.4 million, which equates to FTE. But from your comment, I think I heard a separate, possibly a separate question is, what does a 1% reduction mean in the expenditures? Yes. And that is a different number. So our current projected personnel services is at close to $160 million. That's the actual dollars. So 1% of that is about $1.6 million. And so those are for the benefit of the public, 1% of the general fund reserve is about $2.4 million. 1% of our personnel cost is about $1.6 million.
Thank you, Jack. It was good for you to correct my understanding. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yes, still significant, but a smaller number.
Yeah, it's all those years of being a Metro counselor where we had to cut staff and cut staff and cut staff and cut staff. So darn, I didn't want to live that again. Thank you. All righty, Commissioner Rogers, what have you got?
Just a couple of points and maybe an ask. One, Jack, having done a lot of this work myself, I understand how incredibly hard it is to make assumptions. You tried to in the one sheet that you brought up on what your assumptions are, but respectfully, the two scenarios that you brought up, I appreciate you bringing forward, but that probably should be coming from the CEO, and county administrator would take a look and say, well, what is the possible programs that should be impacted? Because you can play all day. We could play all day with numbers. My assumptions are a little different than yours. I think there's going to be a lot of inflation, and you really didn't tag that the way we would normally tag it. I'm also assuming that as we do a pay equity analysis, if we want to run off all of our best and brightest, let's start cutting wages. I mean, that's not going to be an effective model for anything. So I honestly, my comments are that's a no starter in my mind. That's probably not great. The chair's line of questioning regarding what does that mean in FTE reductions, I think that's, again, the county administrator needs to take a look at that with a cut in programs, because I agree. You can't sit there and say, we got the same work and half of you are going to be here to do it. That's another recipe for great losses. So my ask is along what Commissioner Willie was dealing with, and that is, what does it mean in dollars? And we've played with, you were doing with the reserve, and I'm glad you corrected that. And then you were dealing with revenues, and that may not be such a bad one because if we see any downward change in property transactions, which you're not factoring in, if our collections on property taxes change, we got a problem. And then you also rightly said, well, what if we just do it on expenditures, but you only did it on the personnel, which I understand that, but there could be reductions on the materials and services side as well. So here's my ask, nice and simple, but hard to do. What does it look like for accountants like Jerry or I, or for the board who has business background, who are looking at it? What would it look like in reductions, 1%, 2%, 3%, however you want to gauge them? What does it mean in terms of dollars if inflation changes 1%, 2%, 3% above what you're thinking of? What does it mean in terms of employment costs? PERS has not gone down. It's for many jurisdictions about 32% of payroll, up from about 28 or 29 the year before. So there's 2 or 3% immediately. What's it mean in terms of costs? And you're going to say, how do I know all these things? I don't expect you to know them all. I know you've got your best sorcerer's hat on, but you know what would it mean if our payroll costs go up and down? And you say, well, isn't it unlimited? No, it's 1%, 2%, 3%. And you just say, okay, what does that mean in terms of program? Because it's very difficult to go to public meetings, have people with expectations saying, I want this program. Wouldn't this be great? When we're looking at a couple of $3 million or 4, maybe 6 or 7 million in cuts. That means not every boat's going to rise. We're going to have some cuts to get to increases, but we don't know what those are unless we project what could happen if inflation would change, what would happen if the payroll costs and associated benefits went up 2, 3, 4%, whatever you want to put, and what would happen if we generally had any reductions in revenue. So you're looking at the best you can with the data. We're historians as accountants, not necessarily projectors, but based upon historical trends and then projecting a few variables, what would that look like? And then we give the unenviable task to the county administrator saying, look, at this budget's complicated and we could all have our own levers that we're going to push. What levers would she push? What are her scenarios other than she were going to cut salaries on somebody, which I think is a terrible idea, or we're going to try to somehow blend this out over 4 or 5 year period. And with all due respect, we're not all going to be here 5 years from now or 4 years from now. And so do we want to kick the can down the road and just say, well, hopefully you folks deal with it. They're able to deal with it if they see at least thoughtfully said, okay, these are the kinds of benchmarks. Catherine, the chair, said something yesterday in a meeting with Diane that I think is apropos here, and I'll say this and be my finishing comment. She said, regardless of who the board may be or how it's composed, shouldn't we have some kind of either glide path or some kind of a picture, where we're going, so that we indeed leave it in some kind of good order as this board and all future boards start to transition. That's a very astute comment and one that maybe we should use. So that was a lot of verbiage for me just to simply say, can you look at the variables? And I'm not looking at all the departments. I'm just saying on a global budget, what would it mean if inflation kicks up 3 or 4%, 2 or 3, or whatever number you want? What would benefits increase 2 or 3%? What would it mean in terms of property tax revenue if any of our revenues drop? And those are not hard calculations. We could do that in a few hours. And then the board has some pretty good information. And then I would throw it back to Tanya and say, Tanya, what if you have the magic wand, you get to be the bad guy because the rest of us like really being nice people. What would you take and change? You know, what are your suggestions? Not that we're going to agree all of them because those are policy issues, but what would you change? So that's my comment.
Thank you, Commissioner Rogers. I mean, everything you mentioned is accomplishable in the financial forecast model that we're doing from a number perspective, obviously. And we can definitely, I would like to follow up with you later just to kind of get a list of the scenarios you'd like to see. And we will definitely incorporate that for future presentations. And as far as what that means to impact services, that's something that we would need to work with the county administrator and the department to really tell that story in a more contextual format. That will obviously takes more time. And obviously that's the whole proposed budget is meant to facilitate is the county administrator's take where the organization should go from a strategy perspective to handle the financial realities that we are currently in. So definitely those information will come.
And I think I want to step in at this point and reinforce that we have a board that is very interested in working with our CAO on different acceptable scenarios for policies and programs. We don't at all treat our CAO like chopped liver. You figure it out, give us a proposal, and then we just bleed all over it. You know, that's just not us. That isn't the character of this board. So we want to try and figure out how do we have an experience together so that there is a reasonable approach with the proposed budget that we can then land with the adopted budget. So it's certainly not an us versus her. So thank you. Nor do I think Commissioner Rogers was teeing it up that way, just to be clear. So thank you very much, commissioners, for using your raise hand. That really helped me. Commissioner Treese, you're next.
Thank you. And I think I'm stating the obvious here, but number one, I appreciate the red flag, if you will, from Jack. Here's what's happening. Here's the state of affairs. Here's what it could look like into the future. I think that that's important for us. I think that this discussion has been about solutions and strategies where we're not quite prepared to do that yet. And so I'm just pointing out that we will have a variety of scenarios. We will work with our county administrator to address those issues, but I don't want to stop having the red flag opportunity. So I want to really underscore my appreciation for putting us on notice that this has potential. You need to start thinking about it. I'm just a little worried about the conversation from the standpoint of the employee perception and those types of things. So I'm just raising that issue. But thank you. It's been enlightening.
Thank you, Commissioner Treese.
Any last commissioner questions or comments before we move on? Nope, seeing none. Keep us going, Jack.
All right, well, next slide, please. So next we will talk about the alternative budgeting processes that your board has requested us to bring back. And we did some extensive research into different kind of budgeting processes. And I'd be happy to walk through a couple of those options. So before we start with the options, we have to look at what are the requirements, what are the constants that we cannot change, what do we have to follow from a compliance reason. And the primary compliance requirement that we have in the state of Oregon is really ORS 294, which is oftentimes referred as the local budget law that governs. It really dictates that we need to have a balanced budget. We need to have a very specific public process, and then we need to have the formal submission areas. So in summary, I mean, there's a lot of details in ORS 294, but those are the three biggies that's in the 294 that governs what our budget should look like when it comes to submitting that to the state and become a legal document. Next slide, please. So that leaves a lot of the creativities are actually in the prioritization and the resource allocation process, because all of that is information before we get into the final format of the budget, and also walk through the required public process that is, in our mind, is a bit of a minimum standard because we do obviously the budget committee process, have the budget hearing, but those are all required by ORS. Can we do more? Absolutely. And in today's session, we're going to go over a couple different budget processes, including the incremental budgeting, zero-based budgeting, priority-based budgeting, participatory budgeting, which I have a note that says it's not a full budget process, and we'll go into the details of that later, later in the slides. And then there are a lot more creativities in the budgeting process that includes things like activity-based budgeting, performance-based budgeting, outcome-based budgeting, et cetera, et cetera. And all of that points to really the process of prioritization, the process of allocating resources, and how to conduct that. So we're going to focus on the couple major ones at the top, and then the ones that's under number 5 is really just out there for your awareness that there are these other methodologies out there. Next slide, please. We will start with the incremental budgeting, and how it works is basically, in the simplest term, is taking the current year's budget or actuals as a basis, and then add or subtract a set amount of percentages to arrive at next year's budget. And that's at each program's level. Basically, every program will get a budget instruction to say, this year, you can increase your expenditure by 1%, 2%, 3%, or decrease. And that's kind of the budget direction. And then incremental amounts or percentage depends on factors like inflation, anticipated increase or decrease in revenues, et cetera. So you can see that it's a very simple, clear-cut process. Next slide, please. So we'll start with the benefit of incremental budgeting. The first benefit is it's easier to develop with low preparation cost. It doesn't take a whole lot of work to kind of get to differences between the programs. And then it prevents internal conflicts oftentimes, just because everyone was given the same direction. It definitely does a good job preventing internal kind of budget wars, for lack of a better word. And then it's simple to understand by all parties throughout the whole process. As you know, as the budget is an annual process, it's a very complicated process at each step along the way. So incremental budgeting is definitely one. For its history, it's simple to understand, and it's suitable for stable organizations with very low volatilities in business operations. What that means is year in, year out, we're doing the same service and trying to accomplish the same goals. Next slide, please. So there are definitely a set of drawbacks with incremental budgeting. And the first and foremost is it assumes all current activities are still needed without very deep evaluation of other activities. It has no incentive for departments to try and reduce cost, essentially in the incremental budgeting. And it also, there's no direct consideration of performance metrics. And then it's less suitable for organizations with frequently changing business operation requirements. It's oftentimes, you oftentimes don't hear the term incremental budgeting in private sectors just because that their landscape changes all the time. And it just doesn't work very well. Next slide, please. So with that, I have to bring the current status at Washington County into consideration because as you may have realized by now that our current operation is actually definitely fits in the category of the incremental budgeting. As part of our budget direction we give to the departments is a percentage increase, percentage decrease as a starting point. Although that we do have some priority considerations that gets added in there to the best ability possible. So we assume all current programs and services are needed continuously. And then the general fund departments are provided an increase or decrease percentage target to meet. I do have to say that doesn't include the special fund budgets. Special fund, as you know, that their revenue sources, their expenditure landscape changes at different times. So they don't always follow the incremental approach when it comes to the special fund budgets. And then the certain amount of priority funding are reserved and added to short-term initiatives or new programs. A couple of examples are we have established new programs, we added new FTEs in certain targeted areas because those are county priorities. And they definitely don't fall neatly into a strict incremental budget approach. That's why I added the notion to say that while we do incremental budgeting at Washington County, there are some level of priority considerations that's added into it. Next slide, please. And next, we'll talk about zero-based budgeting, which is a very popular type of budgeting that's kind of in the market, both in public and the private sector. How it works is the process starts from a base of 0, no reference to the prior period at all. And every department's, every activity requires a very thorough justification and evaluation. This forces a questioning environment during budget process where the manager throughout the organization. The question is constantly asked to see, is the activity really necessary? What happens if the activity doesn't continue? Is the current level of provision adequate? What other ways are there to carry out the activities? So those are all very good questions to ask. Next slide, please. And then continue on how it works is it gets differentiated into different stages. In the stage 1, that's where all the activities are identified and then analyzed by managers. So that work in our setting would happen in the departments. And then stage 2 is each level of managers ranks all activities based on the benefit and the activities provided to the organization. So you can see that the benefit of the incremental budget of preventing budget war in a zero-based budgeting, that's entirely in the reverse, basically. It's there needs to be a ranking order. There needs to be a priority order. There will be programs that's ranked higher than other programs. And then we have stage 3, the overall resources are allocated based on the order of priorities, based on the ranked activities benefits. So that is really at a very high level, and in a purist kind of level, zero-based budgeting, how zero-based budgeting works. Next slide, please. There are a couple modern variations. You may hear the term of zero line item budgeting, which has detailed analysis at the line item level rather than at the program level. And then in some cases, including unit costs and quantities, which is very common in manufacturer kind of environment. And then there are service level budgeting, which are activity packages are developed with service level indicated. And usually that helps kind of help with the ranking order. And then the decision makers allocate resources based on the service levels. Next slide, please. So we'll again start with the benefit of zero-based budgeting. It's inefficient and obsolete activities are removed. Definitely, it will be very effective in doing that. And then it does have a bottom-up approach, encourages managers and employees' participation. What that means is that whole questioning about what's needed, what's not needed, what's priority, what's less priority, how do we rank our orders, will get implemented throughout the organization. And then it challenges the status quo and encourages the questioning attitude among managers. And it's good to use when there is an urgent need for cost containment. And that's why you see that in private sector very often, especially during economic downturns, is that zero-based budgeting gets implemented really with the primary target to reduce cost. Next slide, please. So there are definitely some drawbacks with zero-based budgeting. The process can be very time-consuming and cumbersome to execute. As you look through the process, you can see that the entire organization pretty much gets mobilized to do an entire separate body of work. And then the prioritization and ranking process has risks of being flawed. Sometimes it can be built as a very objective process. Sometimes it can be built as a very subject process. And sometimes it runs the risk of being implemented differently among different departments or differently in different areas. And then it does have the risk of being flawed. And then it requires specific skill sets from department managers to build activity packages and may require more training. So not only, it's not like that we turn on zero-based budgeting, everybody knows what we're doing. So there's going to be a lot more training, a lot more education with the departments about how to execute that. So those are the pros and cons of zero-based budgeting. Next slide, please. The next, what we're going to talk about is the priority-based budgeting, which is a relatively newer term compared to the incremental budgeting and the zero-based budgeting. And there are two different governmental bodies that actually issued summaries of this, and one is ICMA, the other one is the GFOA. And at a very high level, so how ICMA summarized a five-step process. And one is determine results. It's essentially establishing the organization's priorities. And then clarify result definitions. Because oftentimes when we work on the priorities, we point to one thing at a very high level. And then how to carry that out and how to define that is a very, very important process in the priority-based budgeting. And then step 3 is identify programs and services that contributes to the priorities. Step 4 is to value programs based on results. And step 5 is allocate resources based on priorities. So, and many scholars and articles actually do refer priority-based budgeting as an alternative or a evolvement of zero-based budgeting. As you can see, that it does have a priority in mind. It does have that ranking and allocation of resources in mind. I think it just does it slightly differently from a pure zero-based budgeting perspective. Next slide, please. So GFOA goes into a little more detail and summarizes the 8-step process. You can see that some of the steps actually overlaps with the 5-step process. In GFOA, the number one part is to identify available resources, which they're taking a little more prudent approach to say, okay, what are our available resources? That is actually where the general fund forecast comes in to say, okay, what does our revenue looks like? What does our expenditure looks like? And then the number 2 step is the identify priority process. As you can see, it's one of the 5 steps that ICMA has. Number 3 is define priority results more precisely, similar with the ICMA process. Number 4 is prepare decision units for evaluation. And the number 5 is to score decision units against priority results. And number 6 is to compare scores between offers of our programs. And number 7 is to allocate resources. Obviously, that's where the rubber meets the road, is how much resources do we allocate to each program based on the priorities. And number 8 is to create accountability for result, efficiency, and innovation. I really like the GFOA approach because it does add an extra step as a beginning that identifies available resources, which grounds us to reality. And then it adds a measurement step at the end, which creates accountability for results, which talk about the performance measurement and the intended result being carried out. So that's the GFOA 8-step summary. Next slide, please. So GFOA also published an article that really talk about the philosophy and the principle of priority-driven budgeting. Those are the list of philosophies, basically. It's prioritize services. It also do the important things well, question past patterns of spending, which we have talked about at different times, but haven't yet have a very robust county-wide process to do that. And then spend within the organization's means. That is very important. And know the true cost of doing business, provide transparency of community priorities, provide transparency of service impacts, as well as demand accountability for results. So those are the principles that GFOA included in their article, which I thought it's very good information to bring to you. Next slide, please. Of course, there are pros and cons with priority-based budgeting. We'll start with the benefits. The budget is well justified and aligned to the strategic plan. That's always a good thing. And then it activates broader collaboration across the organization through the prioritization discussion, through the priority definition. And then it improves the operational efficiency by challenging past assumptions, similar to zero-based budgeting. And it offers the community an opportunity to be informed about the organization's prioritization process, which is a really good thing. Next slide, please. So some drawbacks about this process. Again, it's a very time-consuming process. Obviously, it's compared to our current process. And then its consensus on priorities may be challenging. There are times where maybe different departments don't agree on priorities. There are times maybe your board may not come to a agreeable set of priorities. There are times maybe county leadership within the county administrator's office would think through differently. But again, as challenging as the process it goes, the goal of the process is to get to a consensus of priority for the entire organization at all levels of the organization. So once we get there, that's definitely not going to be a drawback. And then challenges from a budget cycle timing constraints. Obviously, this is a lot more work. In our current budget, we are already running a rubber meets the road, pretty much an 8-month process to get from beginning to finish. So with a more budget cycle timing constraints, it would definitely increase the amount of time that the entire organization needs to dedicate to the budget development process. And then the initial implementation may be disruptive to the organization's operation. And that is very true, just because new processes, new trainings, similar to the zero-based budgeting concern, is that is not a switch that we can turn on and just start implementing. Definitely take a lot of training, takes a lot of communication. Next slide. So last but not least, what we'll touch today is participatory budgeting. And participatory budgeting there's an organization called Participatory Budgeting Project that has a lot of great information, a lot of articles. So a little brief history about participatory budgeting. It started in Porto Alegre, Brazil in 1989. So it's not a brand new concept. It has been around for a few decades. So they refer it as PB in short. It's a democratic process in which community members decide how to spend part of a public budget. Now, underline the part of public budget, even in the strongest advocate of participatory budgeting, it's not referring to an entire budget process. It's really talking about a portion of the public budget, and it gives people real power over real money. That is what this organization described it as. And participatory budgeting is an annual cycle of engagement that is integrated into a regular budget process. That is also another direct quote from the PBP that you can see that it's really not introduced to be meant for an entire budget process. It's for a portion of the budget. Next slide, please. So there's a couple application examples that I have researched into, and one of which is New York City. And according to New York City's website, in 2011, 4 New York City council members with their names listed there, launched a PB process to allow residents in their district to allocate part of their capital discretionary funding. Over the years, the process has grown to include a majority of council members, giving communities real decision-making over more than $35 million in taxpayer money on an annual basis. Now to put things, Pam, Commissioner Trees, you have a question?
Just a quick question. This is really interesting. What percentage of that total budget is 35 million there?
Thank you for that question. It's almost like that we arranged this for you to tee up my next information point to bring to you. Thank you for that question. And the 35 million in comparison to New York City's total $98.7 billion budget is about 0.035% of the entire city's budget. So next slide. Great question, Commissioner Trees. So the next example that we have is the city of Cambridge, MA, and that's the city of Cambridge launched its 8th cycle of PB and collected what they call a PB8, and collected 1,070 ideas from the Cambridge community between June and July about how to spend $1 million in one-time capital project to improve Cambridge. From August 2021 through November 2021, volunteer budget delegates will research all submitted projects ideas, develop final proposal for the December 2021 PBA vote, in which all Cambridge residents aged 12 and older will be able to participate. So you can see that they really expand the whole participation through the whole community, which is a great thing. And to answer your question, what does $1 million equates to in Cambridge's budget? Cambridge's budget, the entire budget is about $1 billion. So a little smaller than Washington County's budget, but relatively in the same range. And $1 million equates to about 0.1% of the entire budget. So to put things in perspective, and next slide, please. So how does the participatory budgeting works? Is that there are 5 steps as illustrated by the PVP organization. It starts with design the process. Obviously, that's what happens in the county. A steering committee that represents the community creates the rules and engagement plan. And then brainstorming ideas. That's where you can see in some of the application cases where they generate ideas, collect ideas from the community. Develop proposals. Volunteer budget delegates develop the ideas into feasible proposals, meaning turning ideas into more or less of a budget package, basically. And then vote, which is the important part, where residents vote on the proposals, starts and then decides on which one takes off and gets included in the budget, and then funding the winning projects. So it's definitely a 5-step process that PBP has illustrated. Next slide, please. So we will discuss a couple benefits of that. Is obviously increased government transparency, especially with capital projects. Oftentimes the community has a lot of opinions or ideas about that. It encourages community engagement on critical project funding, and then it improves public trust. Absolutely, those are all great benefits. Next slide, please. So a couple drawbacks, and none of these are drafted by Jack, by the way. These are all direct quotes from researchers. Some of the drawbacks are potential lack of representation from marginalized community members due to lack of interest or access. Sometimes they may not have the interest to engage in that process. Sometimes they may not have the time or the means to participate in that process. And then second, the nature of slow-moving capital projects may frustrate community members. When a project gets approved, it may not get implemented immediately in the next year. It may get in the budget, through a feasibility study. As you're all aware, some projects takes a 5 to 7 year process, and still you don't see the brick and mortar start happening. So it could frustrate the community members from that perspective. And then also there has been some criticisms from community members in support of the project not making the list. Obviously, there will be winners, there will be losers when it comes to idea generating. Obviously, for the community member that has ideas that did not make the list,
No, it was on priority-based budgeting. Slide 20, the GFOA version. And this was a lot of, this presentation was a lot of fun for me. Out of my private sector experience, I worked at 3 different high-tech firms, and the second and third utilize CBB budgeting. But in the public sector at Metro, we used a modified priority-based budgeting. And when I looked at the 8 steps by GFOA, identify available resources, one thing that I remind myself is resources it's not just money, right? I often think about employees as assets because they have skills and expertise that as you move through looking at what the priorities are for the entire agencies, it may cause you to redeploy those employee assets, that skills and expertise to different parts of the organization. To deliver those high priority services. So I just wanted to mention that. Now, here's the bulk of my thoughts. We have a small team now, and we are continuing to challenge the team to do a few things for us. First and foremost, navigate our current challenges, right? Based just on forecasts alone, we are asking our CAO and her CFO to do scenario planning for us. So we could keep the same style of budgeting, right? And as Jack mentioned, there's a lean time frame or a constrained time frame for them to do all this work that we want. But I also feel compelled to remind myself and us that we have also put in place a need for future planning. And all we have to do is look at our board initiatives under board ownership, page 2, county levies and financial planning, to see our own laundry list. We have a community strategic plan that we know is way out of date and we need to do a new one. But my colleagues and the community have heard me talk about having services that are undersized for our community, or what I call, I abbreviate to community need. Things like affordable housing and homelessness that we are, thanks to voter approved funding, doing some very substantial things about. But we also have mental health, behavioral health, and transportation community connectivity that I've been talking about. But it really boils down to this board being eyes wide open, ears wide open about those long-term generational needs, if we want to think about it from that standpoint. A new courthouse, right, to serve our current decade and future decades. A strategic facilities master plan. For an organization our size, we're really lacking that strategic plan. On mental health, behavioral health, improving our availability to serve the community with the Center for Addiction Treatment and Triage. We have a great concept, but we need to build it because the community's already here. The community need is here. West Side Commons, the whole Fairplex. We have a great master plan. We have nothing more behind that, and we need to figure out how to make that happen. Also, this board in the last 2.5 years has talked about the availability of county services, countywide services to South County. We can't have everything housed up here in North and Western Washington County. So boy, do we have some mighty challenges to meet. Irrespective of service needs and the dollars and cents, we have 10 pounds of work that needs to get done. You know, if I think about that 10 flour sack thing, I know the analogy isn't holding up, but it sure is interesting because we've got some interesting challenges to ponder and try and address versus just kicking the can down the road. So I don't have any answers to that yet, but I think we've got to figure out a roadmap for how we accomplish this over the next 2 years. So that's it from me. You know, budget style aside, we have to figure out how to get this work done. So we'll have to figure things out. Commissioners, any thoughts that you'd like to share at this point? Go ahead, Commissioner Rogers.
It's always interesting to go back into the textbooks, Jack, and look at the methods. It's been a while since I've dusted that off, but this isn't going to be popular, what I'm going to say, but I think it's a reality that it's almost impossible in my mind to implement anything other than the current system this year. I think you're going to need to build capacity to do that. Zero-based budgeting, I've never been a big fan of, but that's just me personally. Status quo, there needs to be some flex to allow people to make comment. I get that. But I just don't see how we had a presentation of, gee, we've got a lot of variables. We don't know what it's going to cost. Commissioner Treese said the right thing when she said, what's the cost of all of this across various departments? That's a central question. This is expensive stuff. Performance budgeting is an expensive proposition. So I think it's just one vote. I think great information. We should build on it and look at next year. Now, we're going to have naysayers who are going to say, but you got lots of time. Well, that's pretty relative. You got to have capacity and number of people. I think Pam was trying to get at that, and I think it's a great question because you're going to have to go to every department and see what does that look like, and what is available and flexible, and how do you involve people. So why it's not popular, I think we heard loud and clear. I don't think it was overwhelming numbers of people, it was small numbers. But why do we even participate if you're not going to listen to us? Well, we're listening. It's just that we're driving a very big ship that takes a while to turn. We can't make darts, and we're not in a sports car. That just not the way it works. And so I like the information. I appreciated the other comments made by everyone. And I think that we're not as nimble as people would like to think we are. If there's some carve out, again, pointing at the CEO, I hate to do that. Again, I'm not picking on you. I just think that's where the responsibility lies. If you can figure out how to do all that and carve out some portion, good. Absent that, and I don't know how, Tanya, you're going to do that, but I never doubt your creativity. Absent that, I think we're just going to build on this effort for the year after. I don't see it happening this year. So that's my thoughts.
Can I go ahead?
Yes, I'm sorry, I didn't successfully unmute. Commissioner Willie, please go ahead.
Okay. Well, I just, yeah, this is all really good information, and I appreciate it too. I know that a lot of work went into this. slide presentation, but I'm still going back to the basics. What exactly are we trying to fix? What's wrong with our current process? That's the end of my question.
If I could summarize that, we have needs in our service suite, and we haven't identified the capacity to meet those needs. Right? I mean, captured in our own board initiatives are a number of major capital projects. And so how do we have the level of capacity within our organization and also within our accounting in order to achieve that? And, unfortunately, we have the realities of just providing our base levels of services. So we have to figure out a way to navigate this successfully as a board with our CAO in a way that explains it to our community.
Yeah, I guess I get that. I don't see, changing the budget process to any of these other styles of process implies that we have, there's some things internally that we change, and all of a sudden there's revenues available to meet the demands that we're talking about that are unmet at this point in time. And I think we do a pretty good job of going through. I think our directors do a great job of going through their budget every year, because they certainly don't get everything they ask for. Sometimes they don't get hardly anything of what they ask for, and the reason why is because the revenue stream is just not there. And so my point is, we look at these unmet needs and the additional services that are being put upon us, and we have to be able to look at revenue alternatives versus what services are we going to cut or reduce to pay for new services that are, the demands are there. And so I don't see how any of these revised budget processes, zero-based and performance-based and all of those things, I don't see them as being an answer to the solution. I think we need to be looking at what we have been doing is looking at what the new services, the new demands for services and all those kinds of things, realizing that we have SHS money now. That was a real blessing. We have ARPA money, and we know that those are relatively short term. So that's, to me, that's where we need to be looking to fund additional services or new services that are going to be put upon us. And again, changing the way we budget doesn't solve that.
So I think ultimately you're asking a really good question of what are we trying to fix? What are we trying to focus on? And so we already identified that there is some new work that we have to try to figure out how to make room for. We also heard from our community as we increased our own level of community engagement and transparency on the budgeting. We heard some interest in participatory budgeting, but also just questions about, well, what are your priorities, right? And so we thought that now would just be a good time to take a look at and articulate how do we go about, or how have we been going about budgeting, and looking at how we might consider other styles for addressing our needs. I think with what Jack was telling us earlier today about our challenges, let alone what we had previously talked about through our board initiatives, is we're going to have some really good discussions about what our priorities are, right? And how do we go about doing that? I am in absolute agreement with you and Commissioner Rogers that moving major styles of budgeting doesn't seem like the right approach right now. But moving forward, we've talked to our CAO about her vision of having different analytics in place so that we can analyze how we as an agency are doing how the work is being done for our community. That's a longer term visioning. So today's conversation isn't about making a decision today, but rather just opening our minds up to other factors and ideas and coming back with her to hear from her about both the immediate term, right? How are she and Jack going to engage with us to look at things for the next budget year and the one after that, as well as longer terms with a much longer glide path? How can we be working together to ensure that the level of analytics and servicing mechanisms are in place in a way that our CAO has a vision towards? So you're asking good questions. They're not ones that we've intended for us to have to try and ask and answer today. Rather, this was just very much a backgrounder, given that other questions have come up from prior conversations. We've never given ourselves the luxury of taking a look at other ideas and approaches. That's all. Does that seem like a reasonable response to your question?
Well, it's a broader conversation than really I anticipated for a budget style process that Jack presented here. It is a good question. What's our budget priorities?
We're not trying to ask and answer that today.
Yeah, no. I get that. I know where we're going with this. I'd be interested to hear at some future point in time. I'd be interested to hear from Tanya and from Jack on this, as this is certainly in their lane, and they have given a lot of thought and conversation to that probably. But so sometime in the future, certainly I'd like to hear what they think about, not only what the conversations that we just had about changing the budget process, but also meeting the future demands of the county with somewhat of a restricted funding source. So we can have that at a future time. I didn't expect to answer those kinds of conversations today, but I would like to hear input from them on that sometime later.
How about this? How about we finish one round of board conversation and give Ms. Angie and Jack a chance to speak and go from there. So Commissioner Treese, go ahead.
Relatively short comment here. I'm just I was thinking as Commissioner Willie asked the question that for me, the issue is really combining our budget and our priorities together. And that's the essence of what this allows us, what for example, the ICMA process or the GFOA process allows you to do. So, and instead of struggling in individual components of our large budget book, it gives us a wider context. So that's, for me, that's the context that I'm looking for.
And I reminded myself too, looking ahead at the roundtable list, that we had set up some time for our October roundtable to come back and talk about the budget as well. So irrespective of our very full work session agendas. Anyway, Ms. Angie, I know we have some more information in our presentation today, but you and Jack have been hearing us talk. So I wanted to make sure we gave you a chance to have the floor.
Thank you. So just some very brief reflections. The purpose of this conversation was really to meet the board's information needs that came out from the session that Jillian Novak had facilitated. That there was not expected to be a conversation. This is the start of the conversation. Some of the questions that were raised were questions around what is our current budget process? How does our current budget process work? We've also heard that question from community. How can we influence priorities or the budget process? So stay tuned on that. We will be talking about the budget process, our budget process for this year. I want to indicate, in my experience, transitioning a budget process, no matter what budget process an organization chooses, it is a 3 to 5 year process. The first year is, in essence, the readiness year, the scoping. Many times an outside consultant is actually hired to help because local governments don't have their own capacity. So if the board would choose in the future to move forward with this, I just want eyes wide open. There would be additional cost, at least to launch a process, but we haven't spent time scoping this. I want to reflect, and I mentioned this during the summer roundtable, but I want to lift this up again. Our central budget team, and when I say central budget team, the team that reports directly to Jack, is 3, and that is for a $1.4 billion budget, 3 staff. And so I think understanding the current resources that we have is also important in this work, and the any change in the budget process is going to put additional work on other areas of the organization. That's not to say we're not making changes this year. Latricia is going to talk about how we will be integrating equity into the budget process. I think that the table that Jack has laid out gives greater transparency also to the community. So I do think our budget process is evolving over time too. So those are my initial thoughts. I am concerned also as we move forward just on the staff capacity of Jack and his team.
Thank you, Tanya. I agree with everything that you said. I may just add an additional note. Out of the team of 3, we're loaning a full-time FTE to do the upper work right now. So literally we have only 2 actively working with 1 in the recruitment right now. So the team is actually very lean, and we experienced some turnovers on that as well. But thank you very much for mentioning the team capacity concern there, Tanya. I agree 100%. And I also agree that it's a multi-year process to,
if I could add, putting that in context, Metro had a budget half the size and the same number of people. So it's not lost on me.
Thank you, Chair Harrington. And from the budget process perspective, I agree with Tanya 100% that this is the starting of a conversation, and really primarily we're responding to your board's request for information from the last work session about where we are, what are all the different processes, and what do they look like, and whether if we make a switch or not, it's really for future conversations with the county administrator, with your board, to get to a county-wide process. And honestly, you can see that some of this, especially like zero-based budgeting or party-based budgeting, actually works really well with a clear organizational strategic plan that is somewhat in its form. So actually, it will play very nicely with the timeline of the strategic planning process that the county is embarking on, and we can actually kind of tag along and try to document information from the strategic plan, which it will be applied to the budget process as well. No matter if we go with a different process or not go with a different process, that whole strategic planning effort is going to help the budget process so tremendously in terms of zeroing in on the county's priority. Those are my additions. Thank you.
Great. Commissioners, are we ready to move on to the next segment? Terrific. We're on the journey with you. Take it away.
I'll hand it over to our Chief Equity and Inclusion Officer, Latricia Tillman.
Hey, good morning, Chair Harrington, board, and team. So my focus today is to just do some high-level overview of what it would look like to integrate a focus on equity in our budget process, and as a subset of an equity focus, focus on community engagement. And so what I wanted to do was just start with grounding us in the definition of equity that you all adopted when you adopted the equity resolution. So equity is the result of fairness and justice in the creation and delivery of public policy, of which budget is one of those public policies. Equity in Washington County will exist when every county resident participates fully in the region's economic vitality and has access to the county's services and other resources and has the opportunity to reach their full potential. And the equity resolution goes further to center racial equity, which I want to just refresh that definition as well. So this is the condition that results when race no longer determines one's socioeconomic outcomes. So resources contributing to racial equity include strategic investments, policies, and practices that reverse racial disparities, eliminate institutional racism, and ensure that outcomes and opportunities for all people are no longer predictable by race. So those are two really meaty concepts, but clearly in the definition relative to racial equity, there is a tie-in to budget in terms of the resources that need to be invested. So the work that we did on our team to look at how could we embed equity into the budget process has been informed in part by our membership in the Government Alliance on Race and Equity, otherwise known as GARE. And through this membership and our professional networks and connections, we have access to other jurisdictions that are working or have been actually embedding equity in their budget process. And so we have been able to identify by looking at these various jurisdictions elements that are consistent for centering equity in budget. And those we've looked both within Oregon as well as in other state jurisdictions in other states, and both city and county level jurisdictions as well as state departments. And so the elements that we have seen, which are listed here, are fairly consistent regardless of the equitable budget process or budget equity tool that we've seen. And then the process gets tailored depending on the different nuances of different jurisdictional budget process. And depending on whether we make a change in our budget approach or not, or which change, or how much of a change, we will adapt an approach that meets the need of building equity into the process. So the elements, the core elements of a budget process that centers equity include garnering both community experience and wisdom, and that comes through community engagement at multiple levels. But really centering on communities that have been most marginalized and shoulder the disproportionate burden of bad outcomes that the county is trying to address. a budget process that centers equity also requires data. So we need to know where the inequities are. Equity is all about outcomes. And so we need to know what the outcomes look like at least by race and ethnicity, and oftentimes looking at more disaggregated metrics beyond race and ethnicity. So also potentially looking at disability, income, etc. And looking across multiple types of indicators. So not just outcomes, which is the fundamental goal of equity, but also looking at the quality of services or the access to services and how that may differ based on different populations. It also requires looking at how and to what extent we provide culturally relevant services or culturally specific services. And many jurisdictions want to have a blend of both, and there's often work that needs to happen to assure that services that are provided to a general population are actually provided in ways that are culturally relevant and not just reinforcing solely dominant culture norms and values. So beyond those three elements is really, I think, the biggest one of a more mature equity budget process looks at transformational interventions. So this is not just looking at, do we have equitable access and quality in the services that we provide, but it actually requires stepping back to say, what are the root causes of inequity? And maybe the services that we currently provide help people cope with inequity or cope with poverty, but they don't actually get to the root causes of the inequities. And so being able to step back and have that level of analysis is something that takes many jurisdictions a long time to actually get to. And then finally, there's the accountability piece. So how do we report back on our progress towards equitable outcomes or equitable access or equitable quality? And what's the communication pathway to the community? Next slide. So as was mentioned, any kind of change in the budget process is going to take time and resource and capacity. And in this environment, those are the most precious and limited commodities, it seems like, or over-tapped commodities. And so for us, thinking about building equity into our budget process would really look like a phased in multi-year approach. Really thinking about portion control and managing the change that's expected for the managers and leaders who are involved in the budget process. So we would start by investing in training with departments and countywide on a budget equity process and a tool. And the process that we would want to initiate would be fairly constrained in this initial year, more tactical, and then move towards a process that includes more of the transformational elements of a budget equity tool in the future. So in our thinking, the initial work would be around engaging equity-focused community engagement, which I'll talk about in a minute. Being able to identify disaggregated data on access, quality, and outcomes where possible. So recognizing that many of our data systems may either don't collect demographic data, and we're not exactly sure how to link those, or don't collect them consistently. So clients served in one department may be their demographic data may be captured in one way, but when they go seek services in another department, their demographic data may be captured another way. And there may be different levels of analytics that departments have capacity to do. So really trying to start with data disaggregation as an initial step. Third, we'd be looking at capturing explicitly how we're addressing barriers to access to our services that may be experienced by people with limited English proficiency or visual or auditory disabilities. And so looking at how we are investing in interpretation, translation, and bilingual staff. And right now that's really embedded in budgets, and being able to pull that out and make those investments explicit is one kind of tactical step to move us forward. And then from a quality perspective, looking at how much of our dollars are invested currently in culturally specific service delivery. So what we wanted to do was add support and potentially some infrastructure to help these more tactical conversations, and do it in a way that allows departments who are currently doing this work to really shine and be able to demonstrate how they're making these investments already. For some, this is not new. It just hasn't been explicit in our budget process. And so this would be really the initial step in this, in the first year going forward. And then what we would expect is that the budget equity tool, the budget equity process, and the training associated with those would evolve over the consecutive budget cycles. So I have 2 more slides, but I'm going to pivot to talking about community engagement. And just to refresh, community engagement is one of those essential pillars of any equitable budget process. And so when I was thinking with my team about how to evolve the work that happened from the last budget cycle, that gave us an opportunity to reflect on what went well in the last series of community investment conversations. And that includes this wonderful engagement with the community, which revealed really significant community interest in wanting to know more about our county budget, and community interest in wanting to engage and shape how our public dollars are allocated. And our learning was that we need to be more clear about the constraints of community input and communicate those upfront, and the constraints of our budget, what's actually, what percentage is actually within the general fund category versus other dollars that have more constraints. And so we want to continue to work with community to develop that part of our process, and make sure that we do have more critical consumers of this fundamental process that we engage in every year. So we want to keep multiple opportunities for engagement, and of course in a COVID environment we'll be keeping a virtual format, but we'd like to evolve this, how we structure those opportunities and how we frame the conversation. So what we are proposing is that we would move from kind of the, what I call the y'all come community investment conversations that were multiple conversations with broad invitation, community-wide invitation, to having a blend of both culturally specific and county-wide budget discussions. And so that would really allow us to engage in that more of a coalition approach, but also have very community tailored conversations to bring voices into our budget process who are historically not participating. The format that we had thought about would be a flexible format, which some may be familiar with. It's called World Cafe, and basically you set a bunch of tables for different conversations. And we would propose framing those conversations around some of the major budget areas in the way that our budget is currently oriented. So not exactly departmental, but more content area focused. And then the format allows people to move in and out of conversations where they have interest. So that would be the format of the discussions. And then we would want to frame out the policy questions for the budget to address more value focused conversations. So what are the racial inequities that are being experienced by culturally specific communities? What are the unmet needs that community members are seeing? And then what's the value set that informs how people would like to see our Board of Commissioners make budget decisions, and how the values that community would like to see us as staff and department and county leaders use to inform how we frame up that budget. So that's sort of a broad overview of what could happen in the fall in terms of how we would frame multiple early opportunities for community engagement in the budget process. And then the next slide comes back around to community engagement, maintaining communication, but also circles back to the pillar of the equity budget process, which includes communication and accountability. So between January and June, when folks are working very diligently on navigating our budget constraint and putting together a budget that the board then has the opportunity to engage with, we would want to build out proactive communication strategies to be able to provide participants and the broader community with insights on how we are reflecting on community input, how we are able to respond to some elements and maybe not to others, but really being thoughtful about what's the cadence of that communication back to community. And that is really specifically a response to feedback that we heard at budget adoption last year, that, you know, we talked to you in November and now we're having this conversation in the end of May or early June, and what happened in between. And so really thoughtful process to reflect community input into how did it impact with our budget equity tool and our budget equity process, and then how does it ultimately get reflected or get considered as part of the overall Washington County budget. So those are some high-level thoughts about both building equity into the budget process as well as community engagement as a part of that equity process, but focus there more specifically.
So I take that as a natural break for questions and input from board members.
We actually have 2 more slides that kind of talk about the entire budget process, which includes this community engagement plan. So, I mean, we can either stop for question now.
I think we need a checkpoint here.
Absolutely.
First.
Yep, we can pause here.
Commissioners, do you have any thoughts or questions, or do you want me to dive in first? Well, Pam's pointing the finger at me. Okay, I'm happy to do so. I need to go back to slide 33. I appreciate your outlining that elements of budget processes that center equity. We've not had the opportunity to outline how we might make improvements. And I think we as a board need to have the opportunity to talk further about how we begin to transition our competency and involvement with this. But on this slide, I really wanted to come back to the why. The why do we see the need to include equity in our budget process? And first and foremost, for me, we know through study that regions throughout our country that work to advance racial equity do better economically. And we want to have a strong, thriving Washington County. We also hear a lot from our housing and health and human services departments that poverty has roots in inequity. And poverty has long-term implications for our community members. And so how do we face the realities of today and make improvements, reduce barriers to opportunity? And I think that's a lot of what we are working to do as an agency. So those are my 2 cents with why do we want to try and include equity into our budgeting moving forward. And it's going to be building. I see a continuous path of improvements that way. So then if I move on to the next slide, slide 34. I appreciated, Latricia, you're talking about how we have to recognize that for fiscal 22-23 and our budget process, we really have quite a constrained process, and that what you're proposing is something that has a transactional basis. I love your optimism with this plan that you have in these 3 slides. I'm not sure that I'm there with regard to execution of this proposal. But if I think about just what you presented on this slide, not only what's here on the page, but what I heard you say, that what I was getting out of these initial steps and this initial approach is that it adds support and that infrastructure or foundation for us to further how we go about serving and demonstrating that we are serving historically underserved or disadvantaged community members here in our community. Because after all, we are striving to do better, and we will make continuous improvement out ahead. But we can't do that unless we have the base infrastructure in place. So how do we get started on that base infrastructure? Does it sound like I've internalized what it is you wanted me to internalize on that slide?
Yes, exactly. It is very much of a starting point. And as I mentioned before, sort of portion control to set departments on a trajectory for deeper equity analysis going forward. Yes.
Great, thank you. This is doing things differently than we've been. We've said we want to work on our equity and implementation of our county-wide services, and this is one of them. So if I move on to the next slide, I appreciated how you started with this is an essential pillar of equity in budgeting. And format-wise, you talked about being clear on constraints on input, as well as what the constraints are of budgeting. But this is where, over these 2 slides, you talked about how we might use a process through this fiscal year. And I am with you in wanting to make improvements. but I'm still a little bit stuck. I'm with you there in terms of changing the style. But what has to happen, it isn't enough for staff to go and have a gazillion meetings with a bunch of different groups. Absolutely not. Who fundamentally is held accountable for adopting the budget and who fundamentally is held accountable by the voters of the community are board members. And so this is where I'm still a little bit, I'm not tripped up. Rather, I don't feel like I'm on the journey for this proposal is, what does this mean I'm signing up to do? And what do my colleagues need to understand this involves? And that's the part that's missing for me. After all, I'm asserting here that we're the audience of the input, right? We have another partner in being in that audience, and that is the CAO and her key leaders to consume that information. And if I could just pose one other question before I turn it back to you. It's on the next slide. I think this is another reason why I'm skeptical. Feels too heavy of a word, but you proposed January through June. And I'm concerned, I think we need to think about this January, April to June as 3 dates, because between January and the end of March, right, that's the last part of proposed budget development, right? Then April, May to the middle of June is where we have to finalize our adoption. And so that's why I felt the need to recognize sort of that midpoint date. So whew, I know I've just said a lot, Ms. Tillman. I really want to do a better job. I'm just I'm held back. I find myself being held back because I'm not sure yet what it involves and how I make sure I know what I've signed up for so that I can perform to my desire. Can you help me with that, please?
I can try. I think if we could go back one slide, this was the area in terms of how to evolve the community investment conversations and really clarify what's the role of the board. I think there are really two opportunities for role clarity here. One is the board, and how do you listen and intake what the community is saying, and then engage in the budget process between October to April, right? And then there's that pivot into the budget adoption process. And I think a lot of it is kind of clarifying, which we'll have to work on getting that clarity for you if you wanted to use this model, how participation would happen in those discussions, because I don't think it serves the community for the board to sit in complete silence and just listen, because the community also wants to hear how you're connecting what you're hearing to what you're thinking, so that they have opportunity to further engage in, filling in gaps, or, trying to maybe shift some thinking in some different ways. So there is absolutely a role for the board in these culturally specific and countywide discussions, and the actual detail work of how a budget may be modified, maybe not the dollar amount up or dollar amount down part, but how the dollars are allocated may change depending on how department leaders and the county administration team is hearing community input as well. And so the way that gets that community engagement gets incorporated in that way will also come to the board through the actual budget proposal. So some of the other things that we can provide more clarity on is how many conversations are there, how much time, that kind of thing. And we would have to come back to you with more specifics on that, but some of the things that we specifically had thought about was having some, culturally specific budget discussions that would focus in on the bigger culturally specific communities within Washington County. So it might be a similar number of conversations as we had with the community investment conversation. So similar time commitment in that way, but not all of them being countywide conversations, having them be more focused.
Yeah. And I think what I'm coming to also understand is synthesizing that information. Yeah, got it. Okay. Alrighty. Still foggy, but better. Starting to clear up. For me, at least.
So let me address then the next question that you had around the communication. And to me, the communication after those community conversations is both about accountability to what we heard you say, and here's how it's impacting our work going forward. And so that to me does look like that proactive communication about the response to community engagement from January to April, as you put that finer point on. And then in the actual ways that departments develop their budget equity tools, that's another point of communication back to the community about how that community feedback was integrated into the actual departmental budget development. So being able to reflect that back, to provide that back to community is another point that probably also happens within that, maybe that April sort of time frame. And then the final one, reflection back to the community about, it is really more about it's not two-way communication. It really is about our accountability. And here's what kind of decisions we've made relative to equity in our budget.
And I'm reminded that of the crawl, walk, run model, that there may be some community voices that are quite critical about how we do this in our first year. And from my standpoint, being the risk taker that I am, I see it as a win simply because we are trying, right? And it's not until year 2, year 3 of the future iterations where you really see those successes and you get more positive voices and positive feedback. The first year is really that crawl. Well, no, it's like a toddler walking for the first time. Yes,
Wobble.
wow, you're amazed.
Wobble, fall, wobble.
Yeah, this is what walking is. And then after that, there's no stopping you. A little kid just does not want to be stopped, right? And there's joy in that. There's power in that. So I feel much more hopeful about this, and I see iterations.
I agree. I feel like it's going to take time, and the message that I try to communicate internally and externally around equity is it's progress over perfection. So we can't get hemmed up by the expectation of perfection to the extent that we are paralyzed and unable to take that first step, that first wobbly step, and to recognize that there will be changes. We won't get it perfect. There will be changes. We need to be nimble. We need to take that feedback about how to improve our process. And that is also part of the equity journey, is how do we engage with that feedback? And that is the second point that sort of sits with me, is I think that criticism that comes from community about we're not doing enough fast enough is one, true, even though we're limited. We are a big ship. We're trying to pivot. We're limited by our capacity and our various constraints. But the criticism is engagement from the community, because they want more and they want to engage with us more deeply. And so I take that as a positive. If community pulls all the way back and says, you know, we're not in it because we're not in it, that to me is the problem. When they continue to push us, that's encouraging to me.
Well, and this fundamentally gets to the why for slides 35 and 36. We only have to look at the latest census information to remind ourselves that our community composition has changed and we have to change with it. And therefore, we are required to make this change, to work to center equity in our budgeting because of the community that we serve. So as a little bit unknown as this feels for me, and I'm very much a person who likes to make and meet commitments, so I need to know, what is that commitment I'm really making? I also am fundamentally remain absolutely convinced, for the same reasons why we adopted the equity resolution, is a fundamental reason why we need to be on this journey of continuous improvement for serving our community. So thank you very much for addressing my questions. I really appreciate it. And I hope this was helpful to kick off the conversation, and it looks like Commissioner Treese is ready to go next. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, for raising those questions. It gave me pause about thinking about the totality of getting community input on equity-centered ideas here. And it raises the issue for me about how do we get a broad spectrum of input from our community? Is it just in town halls? Does it include a survey mechanism, perhaps on an annual or biannual basis? I want to make sure that we are responding to the community at large, not only the loudest voices that are talking to us. And it doesn't mean that I don't want to hear the loudest voices. It just means that I want balance in relationship to this issue of an equity-centered budget. So I'm trying to make sure that I'm being clear that it's not that I don't want to hear the voices. I want to hear all voices on this topic.
Yeah, it's a great question, Commissioner Treese, and I appreciate it. One of the things that we thought about is how do we use best practices for community engagement in this, fundamental policy work that we do every year. And so thinking about that would really mean, how do we engage in partnership with culturally specific community organizations or coalitions of culturally specific community organizations to bring those voices to the table? So historically, it may have been, us, right? So last year, it was us, doing a lot of the outreach with some community partners through a contract with a facilitating organization. What I think we've learned over the past year, and where I think we've developed over the past year, particularly with our experience with COVID and the work with the COVID Racial Equity Advisory Group and some of the various other types of community engagement work that we've been doing, is that we can build capacity in our community partners to engage and use the trust that they have built through their connection to the community to bring more voices to the table than would feel comfortable coming if the invitation were only coming from Washington County. So I really think of it as more of a both and approach. We can use the communication power of Washington County as a jurisdiction to help get the word out for these events, and use the power of relationships and trust that culturally specific community-based organizations have as well.
Thank you. I also think that it's incumbent upon us to recognize where the trust level is now and work toward building that. That's the other piece that I think is very important. And that also extends to the entire community. You know, I think that that's another piece that we need to be thinking about in relationship to an equity-based budgeting process and the education that's important for our entire community around why this is important. So I'm just trying to make sure that we're not focusing on our BIPOC community without educating our entire community about why it's important. Because I do believe that we need to be doing that so that we're not creating a polarization and a, you know, if you get it, I don't type of approach. So I think that it's a larger conversation as well as a targeted conversation.
Thank you, Commissioner Treese. Commissioner Willie or Commissioner Rogers, any thoughts? No? Okay.
My only comment is that, as usual, as I sit and listen to Latricia talk about equity and all of the concepts that she's developed here, I learn a lot. So I want to say thank you. You're bringing me along. I'm probably like that youngster learning to walk that the chair referred to. So you'll need to continue to nurture me along, but I really appreciate this information. So I think it's very good, almost to a point where I wish you would have presented first, and then we get to Jack and his numbers and budget process. To me, this came together much better for me when after your presentation kind of incorporated all the rest of the concepts we were talking about too. So a lot of words. Thank you for what you've done here.
Thanks, Commissioner William. If I can just respond briefly, I think the question that you asked after looking through the various models of budgeting around, you know, how does this relate to what we are or aren't doing currently in our budget process? I think for me, when I think about equity in the budget process, we've got to think about outcomes, and we've got to think about data, and some of those elements are more pronounced in some budget models than in others. And so regardless of whether there's a formal change in process or not, starting to think about outcomes in our budget process, like what are you buying? What are you investing in? And what's the return on that investment is not, I don't believe, explicit in the current incremental budget process. So that is, if we stay in that process, we're going to still have to build out some of the outcomes and priority elements that are in the other models.
Yeah, I completely agree. For me, the insight and kind of the revelation was because again, as a bean counter, we get pretty engrossed in the numbers and balancing the budget and how can we do this versus a step back, which is this is basically requiring us to do, to say what are we doing and where are there things that we can do differently, not that we reallocate money and things like that. We just have a different prioritization, a different focus on how we look at the budget. And it's not all about numbers. And I think that's kind of where I'm going here with this. So again, because you're nurturing me along on a different thought concept. So that's I guess that was my perception of what we're doing here.
Well, and I'd like to add, you know, I'm reminded how much I appreciate our going through this together and these discussions, because of the very nature of the exchange that just happened. It wasn't just about the learning and the exchange that you, Commissioner Willie, had with Ms. Tillman. Okay, I learned additional things from that exchange. Process to a purpose. We use process to get to a specific purpose, right? And irrespective of if we had the budget style first or after, I think what I've heard Ms. Tillman reflect some prior board discussions about outcomes and what are we getting by doing certain things. So I think we have a lot of agreement amongst this board about where we find ourselves and where we'd like to go, and some of the elements that we would like. Outcomes, right? How do we improve our understanding of outcomes that we will achieve, and that our community will achieve as a result of this work? As I listened to your exchange, I was also reminded of a comment that Ms. Tillman made. I can't remember if it was during one of her quarterly updates, or if it was in a briefing with her leading up to one of those. But I remember having a conversation about how we go about this work, and sometimes how it feels a bit foreign or uncomfortable, and her reminding me that this is all one big experiment. Experiment wasn't her word, but no one has actually done this work before. You know, at this point in time that we find ourselves in these conditions. And it made me feel more comfortable that it's okay that it feels uncomfortable. But what the strength and the beauty is in the fact that we are doing the work. And so I am reminded through the proposal that she's laid out for us that this will help us lead to outcomes that we would not have achieved but for the fact that we are willing to go on this journey. And there's beauty, strength, power, and effectiveness in all of that. So thank you for letting me share in the exchange that you, Commissioner Willie, and Ms. Latricia just had, because it helped to serve me as one member of this group of 5 commissioners with regard to how we're going about this. Any other commissioner thoughts? Commissioner Treese, anything? Okay, so you have a proposal for how this all comes together, Jack.
We do. Thank you, Chair Harrington. If we can move to the next slide, please. We definitely had some help from our wonderful communication team, specifically Sherry, our graphic designer that's on that made this slide possible. In the PDF draft that you get is actually one page that is basically web ready, that is print ready, and it's ready for the public to kind of use as a tool. But for presentation reasons, we had to break the details into 2 slides. So just for your information, it's actually 1 document. But we're looking at this slide. Basically, we, under Tanya's great leadership on how do we really reflect the budget process, we created this document, essentially dividing different groups into swim lanes and then add a timeline on top. So you can see the different columns represent the timeline, basically from August of the year before, all the way into June and July, where the budget gets legalized and then executed. And then the rows in there represents the different groups, including the Board of County Commissioners, and on this slide, including the community, the County Administrative Office, as well as the Office of Equity, Inclusion, and Community Engagement. So starting with the first row over here, you can see that we have illustrated that the Board of County Commissioners in August and September, that's really the prime time to start the conversation with the community. And that's not necessarily mean that's only in one confined setting. It's really with any of the engagement that you have with the community, with the constituents about the community priorities. And then the October and December time is actually a critical time where we envision that the board continue to engage the community, having those conversations, but also we highlighted in their finalized budget priorities to CAO. That is something that the CAO actually needs to really start rolling into budget directions, budget instruction to the departments, and then work out, start working on a proposed budget based on these priorities. And then going into January and February, that's where we envision the commissioners continue to have that engagement and communicate with the county priorities to the community. So essentially, we envision the whole community engagement process as an ongoing, iterative, and two-way communication with the community in different formats. Obviously, like quite a few of you have mentioned, that it's actually a learning process for the county altogether. We're making incremental improvements. We're making it better and better every year. And that is the prime time, basically between August to February. And we really envision that October and December is like a critical target time for that engagement, which will help us inform a set of county priorities. And then moving on into May, that's where you see the standard budget process, where participation on the budget committee to review the proposed budget, and then in June to adopt the budget is listed as action items for Board of Commissioners. Now on the community side, this is really where the public information part that comes in to advise the community is August and September is actually the great time to attend board work sessions and roundtables to hear about what is going on in general in the county. And the community always talk about, we don't really know what's going on in the county. We don't really know what the county services are. But when the budget gets adopted, we have our opinions. I really want to build in there as to remind the community that we actually, all of our board work sessions, all of our board meetings are public sessions. If the community are very, very interested in the county's lines of businesses, attending those and hearing about the priority setting considerations based on the departmental programs are great activities to have in those during those time. And then comes October, December, that's where really the communication, the community priority opportunities, challenges can be communicated to the board through different kind of methods to really help inform that priority setting exercise that's on the board. Going into January and February, that's where we collaborated with OEICE to say this is the prime time for the community to provide inputs to the county, not only on just general priorities, opportunities, and challenges, but specifically on the community inequities in access, quality, and outcome. And that's why we put that one in the January to February timeframe. And then come to the May and June, that's really where the ORS required budget process comes in. And that's where attending and listening to the budget presentations to understand the budget, as well as provide public testimony at the budget committee public hearing, and the public testimony at the board meeting as adoption is listed in the community area. And then moving on to the next row, that's where county administrator's office comes in. So starting August and September, that's where the initiation and the management of the budget process starts, right along with my office to start planning the project for this next year. And then going into January, February, that's where communication to the departments on the budget development with priority considerations is starting to happen. And that is where really the budget priority from the community to the board, from the board to the county administrative office is best suited to be completed for the most part during that time. And then moving on into March, that's where departments finish developing their budget, and CAO will start reviewing and adjust requested budget reflecting county priorities, if they're not already reflected in the development. And then April is the finalization time. That's where finalizing the budget message, finalizing trending initiatives and narratives that goes into the budget, which helps my team to finalize the final set of budget document. And then in May, that's where the presentation to the board budget committee meeting happens. OESE this year has a lot of activities, as Latricia has provided already, that entails from August all the way to June. You can see every month that there are activities that OESE are taking on. It involves with everything that has been mentioned with Latricia, by Latricia, creating the equity tool and providing trainings and execution application of the equity tool to the departments. And then the technical assistance, which starts in January and February, that's when the departments are developing budget. The technical assistance provided from OESE to the department on how to develop their budget with equity considerations in there is going to be reflected. And then in March, obviously review work starts. That's where OESE start reviewing the equity analysis on budget. And then April is to provide training and equity tools as a budget committee orientation. As you recall, we had our first orientation in April last year. We're planning on having another one this year. And one added element in that is not only that we talk about the budget process from a traditional perspective, Latricia's team will actually have that training provided to the budget committee on what equity tool looks like in the budget committee process. And then in May, provide technical assistance to the budget committee and the overarching equity analysis and resulting budget adjustments lifted up in the budget presentation process. And then in June is to message and incorporate the equity in budget process and resulting adopted budget. So that's all of the activities that encompasses Board of County Commissioners, community, County Administrative Office, and OESE. Any questions on this slide before we move on to the next? All right. Seeing now, next slide, please. The next slide includes the finance budget team and includes the department, includes the county budget committee. And many of this are very detailed work. As you can see that the finance budget team's work actually starts from August and it doesn't end until July. It's quite a 4-year process for my team, and rightly so. It starts from the general fund forecast, the project timeline planning, all the way into assisting the department to provide the budget instruction, all the way, and I'll just kind of jump through this a little bit, all the way into finalizing the proposed budget, helping the budget committee through their process, and then helping the board through the adoption process, as well as doing the final filing with the state, with our SSN taxation. And then for the department, the majority of their work is through August to December, it's really working with the CEO, working with the board to interpret the budget priorities, as well as connecting with their customers, which are oftentimes an important part of the community that comes in this county for their services, and reflect some of those feedbacks that's from the customers and inventory that as well. So into January and February, that's the development time. And then into March, that's when the requested budget presentation are provided from the department to CAO. And then into May, that's where the departments attend and participate with the budget committee presentation. In July, that's where the budget gets adopted and departments are responsible for operationalize the budget. County budget committee, traditionally, that's where the activity for the budget committees is concentrated in May. We're obviously adding the April budget committee orientation to really provide the new members an orientation on what the budget looks like, as well as existing members on the new information that we're about to bring. And then in May, that's where reviewing the proposed budget, provide feedback, conduct public hearing, and approve budget is the core function of the budget committee. So as explained, that this is actually a one-pager document that we're planning to publish on the website once we hear the feedback from you and make some final adjustments if there are any. And then this can be also made available by print for anyone that's interested in having a printed copy. I do want to say that it has a lot of information. It doesn't print well on a letter size paper. So if we are planning on printing on 11 by 17, and then doing some laminated and more durable copies for CAO and for your board as well once we have it finalized. All right, next slide, please. I believe that will take us to the question slide. Any questions or comments?
Oh, can I start? This is wicked awesome. It's just amazing, Jack. Thank you. Wow. Wow. I am so pleased. It both lays out our budget process and it highlights some very intentional new focuses. And I wonder if it would serve us well to perhaps bold those a little bit more or put a new moniker on so that our community knows this is different than what they've been experiencing. So I just have about 5 comments. Some of them are really quick. So I'm in the January, February swim lane in the row Board of County Commissioners. And the requested budget is the swim lane. It says, continue to engage and communicate county priorities to the community. That feels a little boring to me. What's important to me is listening and learning, right? Because we're all in this together. The word engagement felt a little bit narrow to me versus broad. And of course, I argued with myself in that short time frame. But it's the level of intentionality. We're trying to listen and learn together through all of this and have it shape what we're doing. Now, if I go down to the bottom row on departments and to the prior swim lane for October, December, summarize community input for boards and commissions on departmental priorities, opportunities, and challenges to inform BCC's priority setting. This is actually something that I feel is a bit of a weakness for the organization, for me as a board member. Communication to the board is, it's a little lightweight here. Part of it is because of constraints and having work session time. But it's also, there's a very strong sense from the departments that they own the boards and commissions. And I don't really feel as a board member like I'm getting the benefit of directional and priority input. So I don't know exactly what I am looking for. It might, and I don't like saying, well, I'll know it when I see it. It's just, I mention it as a mere opportunity. I certainly am willing to just keep going the way we've been doing, but I wanted to share that personal insight. Next comment. I'm in the March swim lane. Stay on this slide right here in, oops. Nope. Go to the other slide. There we go. I'm in the row Office of Equity, Inclusion, and Community Engagement. In the swim lane of March, OEICE review of equity analysis of budget. I'm assuming that's new. And that's where I would put, you know, the simplest form, square bracket, new in capital letters, close square bracket. That's new. Yay, we're doing something different. Okay, now I go to the April swim lane. And with the Board of Commissioners, we usually get the budget for a couple of weeks in late April, early May. we also get the CWS budget. So what I'm trying to get at is we do more than just participate on budget committees to review the proposed budget. I think there's a missing line item here, both for us and for the budget committee. We really have to spend some concerted effort to understand the proposed budget, to really see, so how are our priorities put into action? So I would just like to see that recognized in there. Budget review, or budget reading or something like that. Because it develops that sense of ownership that the board and the CAO work together. On the community section, this next one's a question. Excuse me. Question for you, Jack.
Mm-hmm.
I really loved how you had some budget orientation. It wasn't just for the last year. It wasn't just for budget committee members. It was also for our community. And it's a wonderful thing that this budget year we're doing this. We're being very intentional about this new aspect of racial equity in our budgeting and this equity tool. I think it would be great to have another one of your great presentations to the community about what is this thing and what does it mean? So I just wanted to put a plug in for you there. And maybe it will be actualized through under community budget, county budget committees. Sorry, I'm looking at a print version versus the slide version. So maybe it's.
Is this, do we have any?
Budget committee orientation. I think it's on the next slide.
Yep. That's yes. The order of the rows are
different,
modified a little bit on the slide. Yes.
Yep. Where am I? I'm in April. Attend budget. Oh, yes, last row here. Attend budget committee orientation. This is another place where I was like, new equity tool. It isn't just a ho-hum, I'm a budget committee member. I need to attend the budget committee orientation because there's new members and it's a new budget. I also need to pay attention at that orientation because we have this new equity tool. There's a test, Catherine, and you want to pass it. So, and then my last comment is on the previous slide, because it's the row of Office of Equity, Inclusion, and Community Engagement. Could somebody go to the previous slide? Okay, bottom row, April. Provide training and equity tool at the budget committee orientation. New, love it.
Yep.
So this is, I am just so impressed and pleased. I mean, you've got a pragmatic approach here for how we have a process that more people get to understand and value. And it also reflects how we're making improvements. I am just delighted beyond belief. Thank you so much. And with that, commissioners, those are all of my thoughts. What have you got to share?
A quick note, I just would like to know how this is getting to the community. I concur with Chair's excitement. But I want to make sure that this has got a prominent place, and it does provide so much information that it's concise, it's in a good place, it's readable, it looks pretty.
Thank you, Commissioner Trees. Our plan is to publish it on our budget website. So from an online presence perspective, anyone that really are interested in the county's budget process will have an easy link to get to. At the same time, we're hoping to provide printed copies, extra copies to order a number of printed and extra copies. So either CAO or your board can take a stack and then actually share that with anyone that you would like to share.
I'd like to see a link to this in department communications to their publics, like LUT's communications. I'd like to see it in libraries. I'd like to see it, in different. I guess the person we should be talking to is Philip, and just saying, can we provide this link to the populations that utilize these services? And I think that way we get to a larger group of people.
I think you're coming to, Commissioner, is what is our communication strategy about how we're going about our budgeting and doing it better and differently? And so if I could add to your ideas, we have a town hall in December. Maybe the theme of that town hall is, how are we going about budgeting differently? There's an opportunity there.
And what improvements have we made? What suggestions you might have, and what does it look like into the future? But in the meantime, I do think that just getting this into as many hands as possible and is important to start with. So,
and it'll also probably be shared and highlighted in those meetings that Latricia highlighted for our October through timeframe, or at the very beginning in Latricia's slides, around slide 34 or so, October to December. There we go, on community engagement.
So if I can just add, the purpose of today was really getting feedback from the board on this process and to ensure there's comfort. And I know we're still in the middle of a board conversation, but I would suggest a good next step potentially could be us adding 10 minutes to the evening meeting in September, similar to how we handle proclamations, but present this in 10 to 15 minutes to the community. That will give us time to also outline a communication plan that we can present at that same moment.
That's a great idea. Commissioner Rogers, Commissioner Willie, anything you'd like to add?
No, not really. It's been a good conversation, good discussion. I do like the budget process calendar that Jack put together there. So no, it's been a good conversation. So thank you for that.
Excellent. Exciting work. Job well done, everyone.
All right. Thank you, commissioners. This is the last of our presentation for today. So hand it back to Chair Harrington or County Administrator Angie to close us out. Thank you.
Well, I hope the team feels really gratified. I think you've covered a lot of territory for us today. The board asked you to outline some new thoughts and ideas for our future consideration, to touch on how we should stretch ourselves with regard to community engagement in our next budgeting. Also equity in budgeting. And I think what you've gotten here is thumbs up from all of us, all four of us, and that we are absolutely on this journey with you in service to our community. So thank you again for having these very fruitful discussions and putting something together for us that fosters our discussions. Really appreciate it. Really do. So I think we've achieved our goals for today. Any last reflections before we sign off? Okay, job well done. I think we can call it done for the day.
Thank you,
Thanks.
commissioners. We will see you on Tuesday for your next work session starting at 8:30.
Have a great Labor Day weekend, everyone. Stay healthy, stay safe. Bye-bye.